Imagine stepping onto a battlefield every Sunday. You know the rules, but they never favor you. You are the decision maker, the leader, the face of the franchise. But behind the scenes, you are also the target. Every play starts with you, and every hit comes for you. And no matter how tough, smart, or fast you are alone. No flak jacket, no medals, no glory, just bruises, blame, and broken bones. Before the modern era of protected pockets and billion-dollar endorsement deals, quarterbacks were not heroes. They were survivors. They played without the red jerseys in practice, without the slide rules on hits, and without the public adoration that today's stars enjoy. Back then, quarterbacks weren't pampered. They were punished. They weren't the kings of the field. They were the chess pieces expected to get hit, get up, and do it again until they couldn't. This is the story of the forgotten warriors. The men who wore the number 12 or 19 or 7 when no one wanted to. The quarterbacks who didn't ask for praise. They just wanted to win. And in the process, they lost more than games. They lost mobility. They lost memory. Some lost marriages. Others lost themselves. But they changed football forever. Because what they endured forced the game to evolve. Because what they sacrificed gave rise to rules, equipment, and safety protocols that today's quarterbacks now benefit from. And because of them, the position was reborn. The modern NFL quarterback is protected by rules and reinforced by schemes. But there was a time when protection was a luxury. A time when quarterbacks were unprotected, unrewarded, and unglorified. We're going back to that time. We're going to show you what it really meant to be the most endangered man on the field. The years of blindside hits that made grown men crumble. The painkillers just to walk into the huddle. The endless film sessions, not to perfect passes, but to figure out how to survive. We'll look at the names you know and the ones you've forgotten. We'll reveal the injuries they hid and the lives they lived in silence. We'll shine light on the courage it took to play quarterback before it was cool. Before it was safe, before it was a dream job. This isn't a story of weakness. It's a story of toughness, so raw it was rarely recognized. It's about leadership with no fanfare. It's about pain that came without pity. It's about how the most dangerous position became the most respected, and why no one wanted to play it, until someone had to. Welcome to the truth behind the NFL's most dangerous position. This is the journey of the unprotected, the unrewarded, the unglorified. The quarterbacks who made the game what it is, one brutal down at a time. It begins not under the Friday night lights or the roaring crowds of the Super Bowl, but in the silent moments before a play begins. When one man stands alone behind the line, eyes scanning the defense, heart pounding with both adrenaline and responsibility. The quarterback, the commander of chaos, the centerpiece of a nation's most loved sport. But behind the glory, behind the billion-dollar broadcasts and household names, lies a story that too few fans ever consider. This is not just a position on the field. It is a crucible, a burden, and a target. This is the story of why, for decades, playing quarterback in the NFL was one of the most dangerous and thankless roles in professional sports. Imagine the pressure of knowing every eye in the stadium is watching your every move, waiting for brilliance or disaster. The quarterback doesn't just throw the ball. He carries the hope of a team, the expectations of a city, and the weight of millions of viewers. One mistake, one split-second misread, and the entire narrative can shift from hero to scapegoat. But long before quarterbacks became the faces of franchises, they were often left exposed, underpaid, and severely unprotected. In the early decades of the NFL, quarterbacks were battered week after week, often without complaint or recognition. There were no elaborate passing schemes or tailored protections. It was survival, plain and simple. If you got hit, you got up. If you didn't, someone else took your place. The brutality wasn't just physical, it was systemic. Unlike today, where quarterbacks receive the highest salaries and dominate headlines. The early quarterback was just another cog in the machine. Many played with broken bones, concussions, and injuries that would sideline a modern athlete for weeks. Medical staff didn't hover nearby with tablets and protocols. Most of the time, quarterbacks played hurt or risked losing their spot. And even off the field, they weren't afforded the glamour they are now associated with. They weren't shielded by massive contracts, media protection, or guaranteed endorsements. They were players like everyone else, only with more responsibility, more blame, and often more pain. As football grew into a national obsession, the narrative began to change. Quarterbacks started becoming the poster children for success. Names like Unitas, Bradshaw, Montana, and eventually Brady and Mahomes became symbols of leadership, success, and marketability. But even as the spotlight intensified, so did the danger. Defensive lines evolved into faster, stronger, more tactical units whose sole purpose was to eliminate the quarterback. Blitz packages became complex, edge rushers more explosive. And through it all, quarterbacks had to keep their poise, keep their eyes downfield, and keep their team moving forward. What many don't realize is just how much sacrifice goes into that single position. Quarterbacks wake up earlier, watch more film, and carry more emotional and mental weight than most other players. They are the first to take blame and the last to accept credit. Even in moments of victory, their success is often framed around what they avoided. Sacks, interceptions, collapses rather than what they endured. For every iconic touchdown throw, there are hundreds of unseen hits, grueling practices, and moments of solitude where they question whether the pain is worth it. In the early 2000s, a shift occurred. The league, recognizing the crucial role of the quarterback in fan engagement and team success, began implementing rules to protect them. Roughing the passer penalties increased. Hits to the head were scrutinized. But even these changes couldn't erase the scars of the past. Many quarterbacks from the earlier eras now suffer from chronic injuries, memory loss, and even depression's silent aftermaths of playing a role that was both revered and unforgiving. But this is not a story of victimhood. This is a story of resilience. Of men who stood in the face of overwhelming odds and still chose to lead. Of players who refused to step back, even when stepping forward meant taking a hit. It's a celebration of mental toughness, of football IQ, of leadership under fire. The quarterback may have once been the most unprotected, unrewarded, and unglorified player on the field. But that sacrifice is what built the foundation of the modern game. Without those who endured the hardest version of the position, there would be no legends to look up to today. And make no mistake, the position is still dangerous. The speed of the game has never been faster. The hits, though more regulated, are still bone-crushing. The pressure to perform under scrutiny is more intense than ever. Social media adds another layer of critique. One bad game and a quarterback can become a trending topic for all the wrong reasons. Yet young athletes still dream of wearing the number 12. The number 7, the number 15, hoping to one day command an offense, lead a team, and prove they have what it takes. This video series isn't just about throwing spirals or winning championships. It's about honoring the journey. It's about peeling back the curtain on what it truly means to play the most scrutinized, most praised, and often most misunderstood position in all of sports. We will dive into the stories that history often forgets: the backup quarterbacks who saved seasons, the starters who played through career-threatening injuries, the pioneers who changed the way the position is played forever. We will show you how the quarterback became both a warrior and a diplomat, a technician and an improviser, a strategist and a symbol. We'll reveal why so many feared the position, not because they lacked talent, but because they knew the cost. And above all, we'll prove why playing quarterback, despite the danger and pressure, remains the most beautiful challenge in all of football. If you've ever cheered for a touchdown, held your breath on a fourth down, or admired a comeback in the final seconds, then you've witnessed just a fraction of what it means to be a quarterback. But now, It's time to see the full picture. This is the untold story of the NFL's most dangerous position. This is why no one wanted to play quarterback until a few dared to step in and never looked back. The quarterback is the face of the franchise. The camera follows him from the moment he steps off the team bus until the final whistle blows. His jersey sells the most. His name headlines the pre-game shows. His highlight throws loop endlessly on sports networks and social media. Yet behind this glamorous image lies a truth few want to confront. For much of NFL history, playing quarterback was one of the most unforgiving, unprotected, and mentally draining roles in all of professional sports. The quarterback wasn't just expected to lead the offense, he was expected to embody perfection. He had to throw the perfect pass, make the right read, call out protections, handle locker room politics, shoulder the blame, and absorb brutal hits behind offensive lines that were sometimes held together with tape and prayers. Every mistake was magnified. Every loss was his fault. And every injury risk he took could derail his career, or worse, his future life. This video doesn't aim to dramatize or exaggerate. It offers a factual and positive re-examination of how the quarterback position evolved, not just as a role of physical and mental pressure, but as one of constant reinvention and resilience. We dive deep into the eras where quarterbacks were thrown to the wolves without modern protection rules, when backup linemen blocked 4 Hall of Fame arms, and when even a Super Bowl win couldn't protect a QB from criticism or being traded. In the early decades of the NFL, quarterbacks were essentially just another backfield player, expected to run, block, and pass with equal toughness. There were no masks, there were no roughing the passer calls. There was no concern for brain health, and nobody even whispered about concussions. It wasn't just about leading your team, it was about surviving the game. Injuries to quarterbacks weren't rare, they were constant. And if you were sidelined, there was often no guarantee you'd get your job back. Through the 50s and 60s, the quarterback became a more defined role, yet the challenges grew sharper. Players like Johnny Unitas revolutionized the passing game, but still operated in brutal conditions. There were fewer protections, slower medical protocols, and relentless expectations. If you couldn't perform every Sunday, you were replaceable. This wasn't just a battle of skill, it was a test of resilience, confidence, and mental armor. By the 70s and 80s, quarterbacks became strategic commanders, required to know every inch of the playbook, diagnose defenses in real time, and execute with precision. Yet they still stood behind offensive lines that often failed to keep them upright. Many of the most talented QBs spent their prime years dodging blitzes and taking punishing sacks. And still, the narrative rarely changed. They were either champions or failures. There was little room in between. And then came the media explosion. The 90s and early 2000s turned quarterbacks into marketing gold. Their faces on cereal boxes, their commercials on Super Bowl Sunday. But with fame came pressure like never before. A single interception on national TV could spark days of ridicule. Analysts debated their value daily. Talk shows, newspapers, internet forums, everyone had an opinion. A quarterback wasn't just playing football. He was navigating a media storm that judged his every decision. He couldn't just be a player. He had to be a brand. Yet with all of this stacked against them, the hits, the pressure, the judgment, quarterbacks kept evolving. They adapted. They learned to play faster, smarter, and tougher. They started training not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. They became students of the game, mastering film, recognizing blitz packages before the snap, and communicating like field generals. They built routines, mental resilience, and leadership skills that inspired locker rooms and cities. Today's quarterbacks still carry a massive burden, but it is one forged from the battles of those who came before. The rulebook now protects them better. The offensive systems are designed to minimize damage. And the awareness around head trauma and mental wellness is finally catching up. But that doesn't erase the past. That doesn't diminish what it took for this position to survive decades of doubt, destruction, and dismissal. This video is not about glorifying pain or dramatizing risk. It is a tribute to the quiet strength of quarterbacks throughout history, to the ones who threw touchdowns on broken ankles, to the backups who stepped in and saved seasons, to the stars who were benched unfairly, and to the legends who redefined how we understand leadership, resilience, and grace under pressure. We will walk through the eras, not as distant observers, but with respect for the context of the time. We'll examine the shifting dynamics of playbooks, rules, protection schemes, and team philosophies. We'll tell stories of forgotten heroes, misunderstood stars, and overlooked trailblazers. We'll highlight how quarterbacking in the NFL was never just about talent. It was about surviving storms most fans never saw. This video also celebrates the unsung lessons that quarterbacks gave us off the field. The humility of rebounding from failure. The discipline of leading by example. The weight of carrying others' expectations and still showing up with fire. Whether you're a fan of football or simply a student of human perseverance, you'll discover how the quarterback position became one of the most unique crucibles of leadership in all of sports. And we do this with a 100% positive lens. Every challenge we explore is met with admiration for those who faced it. Every story is rooted in verified fact and historical accuracy. We highlight what was, but we also celebrate how far we've come and how today's quarterbacks, thanks to decades of transformation, now thrive in ways never thought possible. Because at its core, this story isn't just about the NFL. It's about grit. It's about the cost of greatness. It's about what it means to stand tall when everything around you tries to bring you down. Quarterbacks have always been expected to be the calm in the chaos, the smarter player, the leader, the symbol. But they've also been warriors, absorbing blame, bruises, and burdens, with a smile on their face and a game plan in their mind. So welcome to this journey. In the coming chapters, we'll take you from the mud-soaked fields of the 1940s to the fast-paced, high-pressure stadiums of today. We'll uncover the stories that history forgot, celebrate the legends who shaped the game, and show you why quarterbacking wasn't just dangerous. It was transformational. It required more than physical ability. It demanded something deeper, something many didn't recognize at the time. This is the real story behind the NFL's most misunderstood position. And by the time we're done, you'll never look at quarterbacks the same way again. Let's begin. It's 1956, and the NFL is still trying to find its identity. Television cameras are grainy, stadiums aren't full, and most Americans are more familiar with baseball box scores than Sunday football scores. But something else is missing. Quarterbacks. Real willing quarterbacks are nearly impossible to find. In this era, no one wants to touch the position. Not because of ego, not because of lack of fame, but because stepping under center meant stepping into a storm with no protection and no reward. Before the quarterback became the face of franchises, the heart of marketing deals, and the reason fans tuned in, he was just another body on the field, and a vulnerable one. No one wore flak jackets. There were no personal protectors on the offensive line. Coaches weren't designing bubble screens or quick releases to save their arms. The quarterback had no privilege, no protection, and no prestige. He was a target, raw and exposed. Back then, the rules of the game were almost barbaric by today's standards. Defensive linemen could smash through the line and spear the quarterback. There was no roughing the passer penalty. Late hits weren't even frowned upon. There was no such thing as a quarterback slide. If you ran, you better be ready to be hit like a fullback. Quarterbacks didn't just throw the ball. They blocked. They tackled. They ran bootlegs without blockers. It wasn't a position of honor. It was a position of survival. Take Bobby Lane, one of the toughest players of his generation. Lane played the position with guts, but without protection. He got hit so often, so violently, that he once told reporters his body hurt more during the off-season than in the middle of the season. His career stats were gritty, not pretty. But he was respected for one thing: he survived. Even coaches didn't prioritize quarterbacks the way we assume they did. A coach's main concern was the run game. Most schemes revolved around halfbacks and fullbacks. Quarterbacks were often an afterthought, inserted merely to hand off or punt on third down. No one was building dynasties around a passing game yet. And certainly, no one was thinking about career longevity for the guy under center. The uniforms told the story. Shoulder pads were massive but ineffective. Helmets were barely more than leather caps until the mid-50s. And mouth guards weren't mandatory. A broken jaw or a chipped tooth was just another badge of honor. And the quarterback, he often bore the worst of it. Unlike today's game, where quarterbacks are almost untouchable, these men were drilled to the ground, legal, illegal, or otherwise. Injury reports, they were rare. Quarterbacks played hurt because they had to. There were no second stringers prepped to take over with style. No next man up mentality. You were the guy, and even if you had a separated shoulder, you were going to play. And then there was the money, or lack of it. Playing quarterback didn't come with big contracts. In fact, it came with almost no financial incentive. Many players worked other jobs during the offseason just to make ends meet. Insurance coverage was minimal. There was no guarantee your career would last, and certainly no fallback plan if it didn't. For quarterbacks, the situation was worse. All the pressure, none of the pay. Culturally, two quarterbacks weren't the heroic symbols they'd later become. They weren't appearing on magazine covers or being offered shoe deals. They were just another position on the roster. Teams weren't investing in quarterback development. If you couldn't throw a spiral by training camp, good luck. There was no quarterback coach, no private mechanics tutor, no QB whisperer. And the fans. Even they weren't drawn to the quarterback. They cheered for hard hits, long runs, and brutal tackles. A beautiful 30-yard pass might get a polite clap, but if your quarterback ducked a hit, he was called soft. Hey, if he slid instead of bulldozed, fans booed. If he got up slowly, he was mocked. The quarterback didn't have the crowd on his side. He had to earn respect the hard way, through blood, broken bones, and brutal grit. Even in the locker room, quarterbacks weren't necessarily leaders. They weren't always captains. They weren't automatically given the reins of the team. Often, a linebacker or a bruising fullback held more clout. Quarterbacks had to fight for authority. They had to prove they belonged, not just with their arm, but with their toughness. And yet, in spite of it all, a few pioneers stepped up. They didn't step into glory. They stepped into chaos, confusion, and pain. But they carried the torch. And eventually, the quarterback role began to shift. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't overnight. And it wasn't without consequences. This story is about them, about the forgotten quarterbacks. The guys who didn't make it to Canton. The guys who didn't even make it to the next season. The ones who started when starting meant bruises, not bonuses. The ones who played the most dangerous position in the NFL, when it wasn't glorified, because before the quarterback became the king, he was the sacrifice. There was a time in football history when the quarterback position was hardly the glamorous role it's portrayed as today. In fact, it was one of the least desirable roles on the field. This wasn't because quarterbacks lacked impact. On the contrary, they were essential. But the cost of playing the position was enormous, and the protection for quarterbacks was almost non-existent. The quarterback wasn't a golden boy, he was a target. And during the brutal decades of the NFL's formation, that target was painted clearly and unapologetically on his chest. In the early years, the NFL was a league built on grit, collisions, and unfiltered violence. Pads were minimal, helmets were made of leather, and rules were crude at best. The quarterback operated in a war zone. Today, we talk about quarterback protection like it's a given pocket integrity. Blindside blockers, roughing the passer penalties, but for decades, those ideas didn't even exist. Quarterbacks were treated like any other ball carrier, hit hard, hit often, and hit without consequence. And yet, despite the obvious risks, quarterbacks weren't given special recognition or reward. There was no extra glory in it, no MVP spotlight or primetime narratives. A quarterback was just another cog in the offensive machine, often blamed when things went wrong, rarely celebrated when things went right. The public praise that quarterbacks receive today was a distant dream in those early years. For many teams, the quarterback was even rotated out regularly to reduce the punishment one player would have to absorb. In the 1950s and 1960s, quarterbacks like Bobby Lane and Wyatt Tittle played with battered bodies and broken bones, often finishing games with concussions, busted ribs, and shredded knees. No one talked about brain trauma or long-term consequences. There was no talk of CTE or post-retirement mental health. Quarterbacks were expected to play hurt, play tough, and never complain. The culture glorified stoicism. If a quarterback limped to the huddle, he was respected. If he stayed down, he was forgotten. What made things worse was the lack of systemic support. Offensive lines were not built with pass protection in mind. Schemes were basic, often run heavy, leaving quarterbacks exposed when passing plays were called. Defensive players knew this and attacked accordingly. There was no such thing as a defenseless quarterback rule. If you could get to the QB, you hit him helmet first, shoulder down, head up. The hits were brutal, and they were legal. Even the style of play magnified the danger. Quarterbacks called their own plays, meaning they had to think and lead while absorbing punishment. There were no quarterback coaches in the skybox, no radios in the helmet. Every decision came from the quarterback himself, made on the fly, while defenders rushed to annihilate him. Imagine being the brain and heartbeat of the offense while your body is being dismantled, hit by hit, game by game. Let's not forget that many quarterbacks also had to play defense. This wasn't an era of specialization. Two-way players were common. And many quarterbacks found themselves making tackles or covering receivers on the other side of the ball. That doubled the risk and halved their recovery time. It wasn't just mentally draining, it was physically devastating. You weren't just taking hits, you were delivering them. The toll added up quickly. And yet, the rewards didn't scale with the risks. Quarterbacks were not paid significantly more than other players. There was no elite contract, no brand endorsements, no jersey sales bonuses. The NFL of yesteryear wasn't a billion-dollar machine. It was a blue-collar league with modest salaries and limited fame. The quarterback had the most responsibility and arguably the least forgiveness. If a receiver dropped a ball, fans blamed the quarterback. If a lineman missed a block, the quarterback paid the price. And if the team lost, the quarterback bore the criticism alone. This landscape created a culture where playing quarterback wasn't a dream, it was a duty, often reluctantly accepted. Coaches would assign the position to whoever had the sharpest mind and the toughest chin. You didn't ask to be quarterback. You were told to do it. And if you survived, you were lucky, not legendary. There are stories that still echo through the decades. Tales of quarterbacks playing with broken fingers taped to neighboring digits, finishing games with dislocated shoulders, even returning to the field minutes after being knocked unconscious. It wasn't bravery. It was expectation. And when you listen to old players talk about those times, you don't hear pride, you hear pain, and an acknowledgement of the unspoken truth. Quarterbacks weren't protected, weren't rewarded, and certainly weren't glorified. The transformation into today's celebrated position came slowly and with great resistance. It required rule changes, high-profile injuries, and growing awareness of long-term damage. But back then, the quarterback was just another body in the pile, only more likely to be targeted, more likely to be broken, more likely to be forgotten once he was gone. This is the side of NFL history that's often sanitized. But to truly understand the quarterback position today, you have to look back at the decades when it was the loneliest, most dangerous, and least appreciated job on the field. Before the lights, before the millions, before the protection. When the quarterback stood tall, not because he was celebrated, but because he refused to fall. The quarterback has long been seen as the face of the franchise, the leader, the icon, the superstar. But beneath that polished image lies a truth very few understand. Before quarterbacks were adored, they were abandoned. In the early decades of the NFL, playing quarterback wasn't a ticket to glory, it was a gamble with little reward and massive risk. As we turn our lens to the 1950s and early 1960s, we uncover the unforgiving conditions that framed the quarterback's reality. No flak jackets, no rule protections, no mercy. Just a raw, brutal game that demanded excellence without offering much in return. Imagine being asked to command the entire offense, memorize a complex playbook, take hits from 250-pound defenders running full speed, and then get up and do it again. Now imagine doing all that without a guaranteed contract, with minimal medical support, and often in front of hostile crowds and critical press. This was the world quarterbacks inherited in the mid-20th century. The glamour we associate with the position today didn't exist. The money didn't either. Most quarterbacks had off-season jobs to pay the bills, selling insurance, working in construction, even teaching. These men weren't living in mansions, they were living paycheck to paycheck, hoping their bodies held up long enough to get through another season. But that wasn't even the hardest part. The mental burden placed on quarterbacks was unmatched. They weren't just players, they were expected to be coaches on the field, psychics, reading defenses, and scapegoats when things went wrong. One mistake, mistimed throw, a fumbled snap, a misread blitz, and they'd be booed, benched, or worse, forgotten. Coaches didn't coddle quarterbacks, they barked orders. Teammates didn't always trust them. If a quarterback was seen as soft or indecisive, the locker room could turn cold quickly. Leadership wasn't a badge. Quarterbacks were given it, was something they had to earn, fight for, and protect daily, and the hits. They were brutal. Defensive rules barely existed to protect the quarterback. Helmet-to-helmet hits were legal. Low hits, fair game. Roughing the passer, rarely called. The quarterback was just another body to be punished, and defenders relished the opportunity. Players like Deacon Jones, Dick Butkus, and Ray Nitschke made a name for themselves by demolishing quarterbacks. A sack in those days wasn't just a loss of yardage, it was a declaration of dominance. And the medical aftermath. A few smelling salts, maybe some tape, and a pat on the back. Concussions went unspoken. Injuries were hidden. Pain was expected. Quarterbacks were caught in a paradox. They were central to the team's identity, yet expendable. They had to be tough, but smart. Confident, but humble. Commanding, but likable. And every Sunday, they stepped onto the field knowing that one hit could end their career. And no one would remember their name. Unlike today's stars with million-dollar endorsements and jersey sales, these quarterbacks were playing for pride, passion, and a paycheck that didn't always cover the cost of living. Many left the game broken physically and emotionally with little support from the league or their teams. Still, some rose above. Quarterbacks like Johnny Unitas, Wyatt Tittle, and Bart Starr began to shift the narrative. They weren't just good, they were leaders. They showed grit, resilience, and a mental edge that inspired teammates and terrified defenses. But even they weren't immune to the brutality of the position. Unitas once played with broken ribs. Tittle was famously photographed bloodied in dazed, an image that captured the pain and sacrifice of the role. Their greatness was forged in adversity, and it began to earn quarterbacks a new kind of respect. Television also played a role in reshaping public perception. As NFL games were broadcast nationwide, quarterbacks became familiar faces. Fans saw their poise under pressure, their command in chaos. Slowly, the media began to spotlight the quarterback's intelligence and leadership. But this visibility came at a cost. The pressure intensified. Expectations skyrocketed. Now, quarterbacks weren't just players, they were performers, role models, and symbols of success. One bad game could spark weeks of criticism. One injury could derail a season. And yet, through it all, quarterbacks kept showing up. They studied harder, trained longer, endured more. Because deep down, they knew something others didn't. Greatness doesn't come without risk. And being a quarterback, in all its danger and difficulty, offered something few positions could control: the ability to shape a game, lead a team, and write your legacy in real time. But the road to that kind of influence was paved in pain. It was earned through sacrifice, failure, and a relentless refusal to quit. As the league entered the 1970s, the quarterback began to evolve from a disposable asset into a team's most treasured investment. But that transition didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without scars. The quarterbacks of the 50s and 60s laid the foundation. They endured the hits, the pressure, the disrespect, and the indifference, so that the next generation could rise with a little more protection, a little more recognition, and a lot more responsibility. They were the bridge between anonymity and immortality. Their journey reminds us that the most dangerous roles often give rise to the most powerful leaders, not because they avoid adversity, but because they walk through it willingly. Quarterbacks weren't always celebrated, but they always mattered. And their impact was never about stats. It was about the courage to lead when no one was watching, no one was cheering, and no one cared. Yet, the evolution of the quarterback position throughout the history of the NFL is a testament to how much the game has changed and how little protection quarterbacks received in its formative years. During the early decades of football, quarterbacks weren't even expected to be stars. They were, more often than not, seen as a cog in a brutal machine, just another body on the field, required to take hits, distribute the ball, and rarely celebrated unless they pulled off something spectacular. In fact, for decades, quarterbacks were expected to be tough as nails and silent about the punishment they endured. There was no fame, no safety net, and no real admiration. The quarterback was more target than tactician. In the 1940s and 1950s, as the NFL was still defining itself, quarterbacks had little to no protection. Pass blocking techniques were primitive, linemen were significantly smaller, and defensive players could deliver brutal hits with near impunity. Roughing the passer penalties were either non-existent or rarely enforced. This meant quarterbacks had to play with a level of courage and resilience that's almost unimaginable today. They wore minimal padding, didn't have face masks in the early years, and often got crushed by defenders immediately after releasing the ball. And unlike today's league, where passing is the centerpiece, the game was mostly about running the football, meaning quarterbacks didn't have as much control or spotlight. Perhaps no era illustrated the violence faced by quarterbacks more than the 1970s. Legendary players like Terry Bradshaw and Ken Stabler endured an unrelenting physical toll. Defensive linemen like Deacon Jones, who coined the term head slap, terrorized quarterbacks in ways that would get players ejected today. Head slaps, helmet-first tackles, and body slams were common. There was a certain honor in getting up after being crushed, teased, but the hits added up. Bradshaw admitted years later that he often played while concussed. In that era, getting your bell rung was treated with medical concern. It was treated with tape, smelling salts, and a demand to get back on the field. But what made the quarterback position truly dangerous was just the hits. It was the expectations. Quarterbacks were supposed to be the leaders, the field generals. That meant they had to play through pain, ignore injuries, and never show weakness. A quarterback who complained was labeled soft, and in the hypermasculine world of football, that was career suicide. This cultural pressure created an environment where players sacrificed their long-term health for short-term success, often encouraged by coaches, teammates, and even fans. The 1980s brought new dynamics. The passing game exploded, and quarterbacks like Dan Marino and Joe Montana began putting up stats that transformed the position into something closer to what we recognize today. But protection was still limited. Quarterbacks were still vulnerable, and now more so, because they were dropping back more often, making them sitting ducks for hard-charging defenders. Blitz-heavy defenses like the Chicago Bears' 46 defense were designed specifically to crush the quarterback. Montana, despite being one of the best of all time, suffered countless hits, including the infamous Leonard Marshall sack in the 1990 NFC Championship that effectively ended his tenure in San Francisco. Even into the 1990s, quarterbacks remained exposed. The rules were evolving, but slowly. The pocket remained a war zone, and defenders often delivered late hits with minimal consequences. Steve Young, a brilliant scrambler and thrower, was repeatedly concussed. Troy Aikman, another Hall of Famer, suffered so many concussions that he eventually had to walk away from the game. The toll wasn't just physical, it was cognitive. Players would forget plays, black out, or suffer mood swings that affected their lives off the field. And yet, they kept playing. They were still called to be warriors first, humans second. It wasn't until the 2000s that the NFL began seriously considering quarterback safety. Rule changes, like eliminating the head slap, protecting the quarterback in the pocket, and banning late hits, slowly reshaped the game. But it was too late for many. Dozens of retired quarterbacks began speaking out about memory issues, depression, and long-term neurological damage. The stories of quarterbacks losing themselves, forgetting their own children's names, or battling depression in silence, began surfacing. The league could no longer pretend the problem didn't exist. What made it worse was how underappreciated these quarterbacks were in their time. Unlike today's superstars, who have multi-million-dollar contracts, endorsement deals, and social media followings, many of the toughest quarterbacks in history walked away with broken bodies and little recognition. They were underpaid, underprotected, and ultimately underremembered. That's the tragedy. They gave everything and received so little. The quarterback position, especially in those eras, was a paradox. It was the most mentally demanding role on the field, requiring sharpness, poise, and leadership. And yet, it demanded the most brutal physical sacrifices. They had to be smart enough to dissect defenses and tough enough to withstand punishments no one else on the field could imagine. It was a role built for superheroes, but played by mortal men. And still, the allure never faded. Young boys still dreamed of being quarterbacks, not fully understanding the price paid by those who came before them. They didn't see the concussions, the surgeries, or the painkillers. They saw the touchdowns, the cheers, the glory. But for every touchdown, there was a hit that left a scar. For every highlight reel moment, there was a silent injury nobody talked about. The league's growing emphasis on protecting quarterbacks today is a direct response to decades of neglect. The modern quarterback may still be under pressure, still scrutinized. But at least now the rules offer them a chance, a cushion from the devastating injuries that defined the lives of so many legends. But it took a century of pain to get there. And so when we look back at the quarterback position, especially in its raw, unfiltered early form, we're not just looking at players who called plays and threw passes. We're looking at warriors. Men who put their bodies on the line week after week, season after season, for a game that rarely gave them the credit they deserved. They were unprotected. They were unrewarded. They were unglorified. But they were unforgettable. The weight of expectation can either elevate or crush a quarterback. Nowhere is this more evident than in the lives of those who are expected to save a franchise before they could legally rent a car. These young men, often barely out of college, carried the hopes of multi-million-dollar franchises, media markets, and fan bases that stretched across entire regions. The pressure wasn't metaphorical. It was crushing, day in and day out. And for many, it was too much. Take David Carr, the first overall pick in the 2002 NFL Draft. Carr had a cannon arm, quick quick feet, and leadership skills that made scouts swoon. The newly formed Houston Texans drafted him to be the face of their franchise, the cornerstone of a brand new legacy. But what they didn't give him was an offensive line. Carr was sacked an NFL record 76 times his rookie season. That's 76 times his body hit the turf. 76 times he had to peel himself off the ground. 76 times his confidence took a blow. By the end of that first year, Carr wasn't just physically battered, he was mentally shaken. His internal clock shattered, and his potential dimmed by circumstances far beyond his control. What happened to Carr wasn't unique. Quarterbacks are expected to be instant leaders in rooms filled with veterans. They're expected to be poised media personalities while still learning to read NFL defenses. And they're expected to win. Now, when a quarterback doesn't succeed right away, the blame is swift, loud, and often permanent. The quarterback is the lightning rod for praise and criticism. When a team wins, it's the coach and the defense. When a team loses, it's the quarterback. The scrutiny never ends. Just ask Sam Darnold. Drafted 3rd overall in 2018 by the New York Jets, Darnold entered a franchise known more for its dysfunction than its development. With a rotating cast of offensive coordinators, limited weapons, and a porous offensive line, Darnold struggled. The media quickly labeled him a bust. Seeing ghosts, he once muttered on a hot mic during a brutal game. That phrase followed him for years. But the reality was more complex. Darnold had raw talent, but the environment around him was toxic for growth. He was judged not for who he was, but for what the team failed to build around him. The same script repeated with other young quarterbacks. Josh Rosen, drafted 10th overall in 2018, played behind a shaky line on a rebuilding Arizona Cardinals team. He was traded after 1 season, 1 year, and labeled a failure before he had a real chance. The league's memory is short, and its patience even shorter. This revolving door of young quarterbacks being thrown to the wolves, then discarded, speaks to a systemic issue. The quarterback is the most difficult position in sports, yet it's the least protected from unrealistic expectations. Development takes time. Confidence takes nurturing. But in today's NFL, if you don't win in year 1 or 2, the noise grows unbearable. The media plays a major role. The 24/7 news cycle means every throw, every misstep, and every body language moment is dissected in real time. One poor performance can dominate headlines for a week. One awkward interview can spark questions about leadership. One loss can lead to calls for benching. The quarterback isn't allowed to grow privately. Every mistake is public. Social media has only amplified this pressure. Young quarterbacks now face a torrent of criticism from fans, analysts, and trolls alike. They can't escape it. Scroll through the replies under a quarterback's Instagram post after a tough loss and ULLC threats, name-calling, and armchair coaching. For a 22-year-old just trying to survive in the league, the psychological toll is immense. They re-asked to carry a franchise and fend off millions of critics, all while adjusting to life as a professional. And then there's the mental burden. Quarterbacks must master some of the most complex playbooks in sports. They must memorize protections, read defensive fronts, identify blitzes, and process information in under 3 seconds. It's a mental gauntlet that never ends. The speed of the NFL is unforgiving, and the margin for error is razor thin. A misread safety can mean a pick six. A late throw can mean a season-ending injury. Contrast that with how other positions are treated. A rookie cornerback gets burned, growing pains. A rookie left tackle allows a sack. He'll learn. A rookie running back fumbles. He'll bounce back. But a quarterback throws 2 interceptions and the questions are existential. Is he the guy? Should the team draft another quarterback? Does he have it? The reality is that the quarterback position, while revered, is also a setup for failure if not handled with care. Many careers are ruined not by a lack of talent, but by poor timing, bad teams, unstable coaching staffs, and relentless scrutiny. The NFL has seen countless examples of quarterbacks who might have thrived elsewhere but flamed out due to the chaos around them. Alex Smith is a story of both failure and redemption. Drafted number 1 overall in 2005 by the San Francisco 49ers, Smith cycled through 7 different offensive coordinators in his first 7 seasons. Imagine learning a new language every year, then being judged for not being fluent. Smith was mocked early in his career, labeled a bust, and nearly run out of town. But when stability arrived with coach Jim Harbaugh and a strong defense, Smith led the 49ers to the NFC Championship game. He wasn't a bust. He was a product of his environment, like so many others. The NFL loves to glamorize quarterbacks, but it often fails to protect them. Not just with offensive lines or play calling, but with patience, with development plans, with mental health resources. The league's most important position remains the most vulnerable to dysfunction. And perhaps that's the greatest danger of all. Not the hits, not the sacks, but the emotional wear and tear of being judged, dissected, and discarded before a young man's full story can unfold. The quarterback position is a crucible. Only a few emerge from it unscathed. Most are broken long before we truly understand what they could have become. Before the modern NFL evolved into a pass-heavy spectacle with high-paid quarterbacks and rules designed to protect them, the position was once considered expendable, a dangerous role that offered little glory and even less safety. In the early decades of football, the quarterback wasn't the untouchable star you see today. He was simply another body on the field, tasked with directing plays, taking hits, and, in many cases, blocking and tackling like everyone else. The equipment was minimal. Helmets were made of leather, without face masks. Shoulder pads were rudimentary, and in some cases, players simply wore thick shirts for protection. The football itself was rounder and harder to throw, which meant passing was rare and awkward. The quarterback was an TA, precision passer in those days. He was a gritty field general who got slammed to the turf as often as he handed off the ball. When passing plays did occur, they often resulted in interceptions or devastating hits from defenders who had no restrictions on where or how they could tackle. During the 1930s and 1940s, the quarterback was more of a facilitator than a star. He called the plays in the huddle, lined up under center, and often ran the ball himself. This put him directly in harm's way. Defenders could, and did, target quarterbacks relentlessly, knowing they were the brain of the offense. A clean tackle was rare. Eye-gouging, knee shots, and pile-driving tackles were part of the game. There were no roughing the passer calls, no late-hit penalties. If you held onto the ball too long, you were fair game until the whistle blew, and sometimes even after it. In this era, quarterbacks weren't protected by massive offensive linemen in the way they are today. Offensive schemes were simpler, blocking assignments less specialized, and defenses were built to swarm the ball carrier, which was often the quarterback. A blitz in those days wasn't a calculated gamble. It was a full-on charge of multiple defenders crashing through the line with no thought of coverage. Quarterbacks could expect to be hit by 2, 3, or even 4 men at once. One of the earliest examples of a quarterback enduring this brutality was Sid Luckman of the Chicago Bears. Luckman, who played in the 1940s, is remembered as one of the pioneers of the passing game. But for every touchdown pass he threw, there were countless plays where he was flattened into the dirt. He played through broken ribs, concussions, and countless bruises, because that was simply what the position demanded. Back then, leaving the game for an injury was considered a sign of weakness. Quarterbacks stayed in, no matter how battered they were. Even into the 1950s, as the forward pass became more common, the quarterback was far from a protected commodity. Legends like Bobby Lane and Wyatt Tittle took punishing hits regularly, often from defenders who had been sprinting full speed without fear of penalty. Lane famously played with a broken nose, multiple stitches, and injuries that today would sideline a player for weeks. His toughness was legendary. But it also highlighted the unspoken truth. The quarterback position was brutal, and no one was stepping in to shield them from harm. What made the job even riskier in these early years was the lack of specialization. Many quarterbacks played both offense and defense, meaning they'd take the field as defensive backs or safeties after leading the offense. This doubled their exposure to injury and fatigue. Imagine today's quarterbacks having to tackle running backs or cover receivers immediately after throwing a pass. That was standard practice back then. The financial rewards didn't match the risk either. Quarterbacks were not the highest paid players on the team. In some cases, they were paid less than star running backs or linemen. There was no guarantee of job security, no long-term contracts with millions guaranteed. If a quarterback got injured, he could easily lose his roster spot to a younger, healthier player. The game was unforgiving, and careers were often short-lived. In this era, the position attracted players who were not only skilled, but willing to endure physical punishment on a weekly basis. They weren't chasing fame or fortune, because neither was guaranteed. They were simply in love with the game, willing to take the hits and keep getting back up. That grit defined the quarterback position long before it became the glamorous role it is today. The danger was so deeply ingrained in the culture of the game that many athletes, even talented passers, avoided the position altogether. Coaches often had to persuade players to take on the quarterback role because of the beating they'd endure. In high school and college, star athletes sometimes shifted to other positions to avoid the constant physical punishment that came with being under center. This was the NFL's most dangerous position, not just because of the hits, but because of the constant exposure to danger, the lack of protective rules, and the expectation that you'd endure it all without complaint. The quarterbacks of this era laid the foundation for the modern game. But they did so at a cost. One measured in broken bones, battered bodies, and shortened careers. The late 1950s into the 1960s marked a turning point in the quarterback's journey. Not because the position got safer, but because the danger evolved. By this time, the NFL was growing from a gritty regional league into a national spectacle. Television was beaming games into living rooms every Sunday, and kids from coast to coast were now seeing, in real time, the way quarterbacks were hit, harassed, and humbled. And if anything, the increased spotlight made the defenders hungrier. The passing game was becoming a more central weapon, but that only meant defensive coordinators were finding new, more creative ways to get to the man holding the ball. Gone were the days when a defensive front simply charged forward and hoped for the best. By the early 1960s, defensive schemes had grown into intricate chess matches. Coaches like Tom Landry of the Dallas Cowboys began engineering blitz packages that were almost surgical. Linebackers would delay their rush until the perfect moment, timing it so the quarterback's eyes were locked downfield and his body was fully exposed. Defensive backs would disguise their coverage, baiting the quarterback into holding the ball for just a fraction too long, long enough for the pocket to collapse. It wasn't just about sacking the quarterback anymore. It was about rattling him, shaking his confidence, forcing him to hear footsteps even when no one was there. The league's rulebook still gave defenders nearly free rein. Roughing the passer was an official penalty, yes, but the definition was so loose and the calls so rare that defenders treated it like a rumor more than a reality. Quarterbacks could be hit high, low, or late. They could be driven into the ground, have their helmets yanked, or take a forearm to the chin without drawing a flag. It was understood, if you played quarterback, you accepted that you were a target, and not just a target for one play. If a defense smelled vulnerability, they would keep coming after you, hit after hit, till you either left the game or your passes floated short and shaky. This era gave rise to a particular kind of defensive mentality. Hit the quarterback early, and you've already won half the battle. Many defensive linemen and linebackers have admitted in later interviews that their first quarter goal was to plant the quarterback into the turf so hard that he'd start questioning his decisions before he made them. And make no mistake, the turf itself was a weapon. The 1960s saw the introduction of artificial surfaces in certain stadiums, and these early versions of AstroTurf were nothing like the modern padded variations. They were essentially thin carpets stretched over a concrete slab. Being slammed down onto that surface felt less like falling on grass and more like being body slammed onto a sidewalk. Quarterbacks emerged from games with elbows raw from turf burns, knees swollen from awkward landings, and backs stiff from the sheer impact of being driven down again and again. Johnny Unitas, the Baltimore Colts legend, became the embodiment of quarterback toughness during this era. His stoic demeanor, flat-top haircut, and relentless will to win became part of NFL folklore. But behind the myth was a man who endured pain that would sideline most athletes today. Broken ribs, dislocated fingers, sprained ankles. Unitas played through them all, often with little more than some tape, painkillers, and a nod from the team doctor. There's the famous story of Unitas breaking his jaw, getting it wired shut, and still returning later in the season with a custom face guard bolted to his helmet. He couldn't even yell the signals clearly, but he could still throw, and in his mind, that was enough. That was the unspoken code. You didn't quit. Ever. But toughness wasn't the only thing quarterbacks needed. With defensive schemes becoming more complex, the mental demands of the position increased dramatically. Quarterbacks had to make reads faster, adjust to disguised coverages, and still deliver pinpoint throws, all while bracing for the inevitable hit. One moment of hesitation could mean an interception, a sack, or both. And protection, it wasn't what it is today. Offensive linemen were simply not as massive or specialized. The average tackle in the 1960s weighed under 270 pounds, which made them smaller than many of the defenders they were trying to block. Pass blocking techniques were less refined, and the rules limited how linemen could use their hands, making it even harder to keep defenders away from the quarterback. Even the most mobile quarterbacks couldn't fully escape the danger. Fran Tarkenton of the Minnesota Vikings was famous for his scrambling style, often darting around the backfield in dizzying circles to evade defenders. His agility saved him from countless sacks, but it also meant taking hits on the run. Hits from angles that made it nearly impossible to protect himself. Tarkenton's style thrilled fans, but it also illustrated a truth about the era. No matter how elusive you were, you couldn't avoid the punishment forever. Quarterbacks of the 1960s also lived with a constant awareness that there were fewer safety nets for their careers. A severe injury could end not just a season, but an entire livelihood. There were no multi-million-dollar guaranteed contracts. Medical technology was decades behind what it is today. A torn ligament could be a career-ending injury, and a concussion was often just called getting your bell rung, with players expected to shake it off and return. Yet, despite the relentless hits, the mental strain, and the constant threat of injury, the men who played quarterback in this era carried themselves with an unmistakable pride. They understood the role wasn't just about throwing the ball. It was about leading under fire, quite literally. Every snap was a calculated risk. Every completion a small victory, not just for the scoreboard, but for their own survival. The late 1960s also marked the beginning of something else. The quarterback as a public figure. With TV broadcasts bringing their faces and names into homes nationwide, quarterbacks started becoming symbols for their franchises. Fans didn't just root for a team, they rooted for the man under center. And that visibility only magnified the stakes. When a quarterback limped back to the huddle, blood on his jersey, fans saw it. When he shook off a brutal sack and delivered a perfect deep ball, they saw that too. But there was a trade-off. The more visible the quarterback became, the more defenses relished the chance to humble him in front of millions. In many ways, the danger of the position wasn't just physical anymore. It was psychological. And for the men of that era, mastering both was the only way to survive. By the dawn of the 1970s, the quarterback had become something more than just another position. He was a lightning rod, a leader, and in many ways, a shield for his team. Every game was a test of resilience, and every hit was a reminder that in football, the most important player on the field was also the most hunted. The 1970s were a defining decade for the NFL, a period when the league's popularity exploded. Television money poured in, and the game itself became faster, more strategic, and, for quarterbacks, more hazardous than ever. This was the era of the steel curtain, the doomsday defense, and the purple people eaters. It was the era when defensive coordinators mastered the art of pressure, and blitzing became both a science and a statement. Quarterbacks entering the league in the early 70s quickly learned that survival required more than a strong arm and a sharp mind. They were stepping into a league where defenses played with a swagger that bordered on intimidation. And their mission was simple: dismantle the man under center before he could get comfortable. The game was evolving in ways that made life even more difficult for quarterbacks. Passing was becoming a bigger part of the offensive strategy. But this also meant more dropbacks, more moments of standing still behind a line that had to hold back increasingly athletic pass rushers. The defenders of the 70s were bigger, stronger, and faster than those of the previous decade. And they were arriving at the quarterback with bad intentions. Consider the Pittsburgh Steelers' steel curtain defense. L.C. Greenwood, Mean Joe Green, Dwight White, and Ernie Holmes weren't just linemen. They were a moving wall of force, collapsing pockets with raw power and relentless pursuit. Their hits on quarterbacks were bone-rattling, and they made no apologies for it. For them, getting to the quarterback was a psychological game. One hit could change the tone of an entire matchup. The Dallas Cowboys' doomsday defense had a similar effect. Under Tom Landry's meticulous schemes, their pass rush became unpredictable, forcing quarterbacks to guess where the pressure would come from. Roger Staubach, ironically a quarterback himself, faced these kinds of defenses every week and knew firsthand that one mistake against them could lead to disaster. Then there were the Minnesota Vikings' purple people eaters, led by Alan Page, Carl Eller, Jim Marshall, and Gary Larson. They attacked quarterbacks with such consistency that opposing offenses often had to alter their entire game plan just to give their passer a fighting chance. This was also the decade when defensive backs became more aggressive, thanks in part to the bump-and-run coverage style. Cornerbacks like Mel Blount used their size and physicality to jam receivers at the line, disrupting routes and forcing quarterbacks to hold onto the ball longer, giving the pass rush even more time to close in. Mel Blount's style was so dominant that it eventually led to rule changes in the late 70s. But until then, it was yet another reason quarterbacks took so many hits. The rules of the game still offered little protection. Roughing the passer was rarely called, unless a hit was egregiously late or blatantly dirty. That meant quarterbacks could be slammed into the ground, driven into the turf, or even hit helmet to helmet without much consequence for the defense. Hits that would draw instant flags today were considered good football in the 1970s. Quarterbacks like Terry Bradshaw, Ken Stabler, and Bob Grease became legends in part because they could take punishment and keep playing. Bradshaw, in particular, was known for his toughness. He played with cracked ribs, a broken nose, and a badly sprained wrist at various points in his career, often refusing to come out of the game. Stabler, nicknamed the Snake, wasn't as physically imposing, but he had a cool under pressure that allowed him to stand tall in the pocket, even as defenders closed in. And then there was Fran Tarkenton, still in the league and still scrambling like no one else. His mobility helped him survive, but it didn't make him invincible. He was hit hard and often, and his longevity was as much a testament to his conditioning as it was to his elusiveness. The 1970s also saw the emergence of the quarterback as a true franchise centerpiece. The Super Bowl era was in full swing, and with it came an increased focus on the quarterbacks who led their teams there. Winning quarterbacks became national celebrities, and their images were tied to the league's growing brand. But that fame came at a cost. Defenses targeted them even more aggressively, knowing that taking out the opposing quarterback could cripple an offense. Equipment technology was improving, but not by much. Helmets were better than those of the 1950s, with more padding and sturdier face masks, but they still didn't provide the concussion protection of modern designs. Shoulder pads were lighter and allowed for more mobility, but they offered little help against the crushing force of a blindside sack. Offensive lines were adapting to, but they still didn't have the advantages linemen enjoy today. Pass blocking techniques were improving, but defenders were allowed to use far more physical tactics: grabbing, clubbing, even clotheslining that made it incredibly difficult to keep the pocket clean. Every Sunday was a test of resilience. Quarterbacks went into games knowing they would be hit, knowing they would be sore on Monday, and knowing that any single play could result in an injury that might linger for weeks or even months. The position demanded a rare combination of skill, intelligence, toughness, and leadership, and the ability to get back up no matter how many times you were knocked down. By the end of the 1970s, the NFL was at a crossroads. Fans loved the toughness and physicality of the game, but there were whispers about whether the brutality was taking too great a toll on its stars. The league would eventually make changes in the following decades to better protect quarterbacks, but in the 1970s, the danger was still very real, and for many, that danger was part of the game's appeal. By the dawn of the 1980s, defenses weren't just reacting to offensive plays, they were dictating them. Coordinators had spent the previous 2 decades refining pressure packages, and now the blitz had become a weapon of choice, not just a desperation move. For quarterbacks, that meant the days of simply dropping back, scanning the field, and throwing at their own pace were gone. Every snap now felt like a countdown clock, ticking faster and faster toward impact. The blitz wasn't new, but the variety and creativity with which it was deployed in the 80s made it more dangerous than ever. Linebackers came screaming through gaps, cornerbacks timed sneaky off-stage rushes, and safeties disguised their intentions until the last possible second. Quarterbacks had to read not only the defense's alignment, but also its intentions. A split-second miscalculation could mean a sack, a fumble, or worse. Defenses like Buddy Ryan's Philadelphia Eagles and Chicago Bears took this concept to its extreme. Ryan's 46 defense with the Bears in the mid-1980s became a nightmare for quarterbacks. It overloaded the line of scrimmage, dared the quarterback to find an open man before the pocket collapsed, and hit him with relentless waves of pressure from all angles. The 1985 Bears defense, widely regarded as one of the greatest of all time, didn't just sack quarterbacks, broke their will. In Philadelphia, Ryan unleashed Reggie White, Clyde Simmons, and Jerome Brown, 3 pass rushers who could each take over a game. Reggie White, nicknamed the Minister of Defense, could bull rush through a 300-pound lineman as if he were made of paper. When White got his hands on a quarterback, there was no gentle takedown. It was a violent collision that could end a drive instantly. Meanwhile, the New York Giants had Lawrence Taylor, a player so disruptive that he forced offenses to reinvent protection schemes. Elt's speed off the edge was unprecedented. Quarterbacks knew that if they didn't see him, they'd feel him, usually from behind. With a hit that could change the outcome of a game in a single moment, Taylor didn't just tackle quarterbacks, he terrified them. This era was also a proving ground for the mental toughness of the position. Playing quarterback now meant processing a flood of information in seconds, reading coverages, anticipating disguised blitzes, adjusting protection calls, and still delivering an accurate throw, all while bracing for impact. A quarterback who hesitated, even slightly, was as good as sacked. The toll was brutal. The 1980s saw some of the highest sack totals in NFL history. Quarterbacks took hits that would result in automatic penalties today. Hits to the helmet, hits after the throw, hits with all of the defender's body weight landing on them. These were routine, expected, and part of the job description. Even legends weren't immune. Joe Montana, one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play, was famously knocked out of the 1990 NFC Championship game by Giants defensive lineman Leonard Marshall in a crushing blindside hit. That was Montana's reality. Brilliance paired with vulnerability. The position was still unglamorous compared to modern standards. Quarterbacks were leaders, yes, but the league had not yet wrapped them in the protective bubble we see today. If a quarterback couldn't withstand the punishment, he didn't last long. Offenses tried to adapt with quicker passing concepts, slants, screens, and timing routes to neutralize the blitz. But this only meant that defenses began disguising their rushes, better baiting quarterbacks into throwing into coverage. The chess match was constant, and the margin for error was razor thin. Quarterbacks like Dan Marino, John Elway, and Warren Moon thrived because they had a combination of quick release, pocket awareness, and fearlessness. Marino, in particular, neutralized the blitz with perhaps the fastest release in NFL history. Elway extended plays with his legs and a cannon arm, while Moon used precise timing to hit receivers before defenders could adjust. Still, even these greats took their share of punishment. Broken ribs, separated shoulders, concussions, and torn ligaments were part of the reality. There was no concussion protocol like today's. If a quarterback could stand and see straight, he was often expected to go back in the game. The 1980s cemented the idea that quarterback was not just a position of skill, but of survival. It demanded equal parts intelligence, courage, and durability. The hits were harder, the schemes more complex, and the pressure relentless. And yet, the position continued to attract the rare few who could handle all of it. Men willing to stand in the eye of the storm and deliver the ball, no matter the cost. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the phrase blindside hit had entered the everyday vocabulary of football fans. It described one of the most violent, game-changing moments a quarterback could endure. The unseen hit from a defender coming from behind or the non-throwing side. For right-handed quarterbacks, that meant the left tackle's ability or inability. To hold off a pass rusher could be the difference between a completed pass and a trip to the trainer's table. Quarterbacks learned quickly that even the best protection could fail in an instant. All it took was one missed assignment or one defender who refused to be blocked. And when that happened, the results could be devastating, without the benefit of seeing the hit coming. A quarterback's body was often limp at the moment of impact, a recipe for whiplash, head trauma, and awkward landings that led to sprains, dislocations, and worse. Few examples illustrate this better than the career of Joe Theismann. In 1985, on a Monday night, he was sacked by Giants legend Lawrence Taylor in a play so infamous, it's still replayed in NFL history reels. Taylor came from Theismann's blind side, and the awkward collision caused Theismann's leg to snap in a way that ended his career instantly. It was a reminder to every quarterback watching. You could be one play away from never taking another snap. The fear of the blind side wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct. Defensive coordinators knew that if they could pressure a quarterback from the side he couldn't see, they could disrupt not only a play, but an entire offensive game plan. Blindside hits had a psychological effect. A quarterback who took a few early in a game might start anticipating them, speeding up his throws and making uncharacteristic mistakes. That's why teams began placing a premium on elite left tackles, the so-called quarterback's bodyguard. Players like Anthony Munoz, Jim Lachey, and later Jonathan Ogden became invaluable, protecting franchise quarterbacks from the most dangerous angle of attack. Coaches understood that a great blindside protector was worth his weight in gold, not just for physical safety, but for the confidence it gave their passer. Yet even with a strong left tackle, the dangers persisted. Defenses countered by developing more agile and explosive edge rushers. They stunted and looped defenders, forcing offensive lines to switch assignments on the fly. They sent cornerbacks and safeties on delayed blitzes, targeting the moments when a quarterback was most vulnerable. Some quarterbacks adapted by developing a sixth sense for pressure. Steve Young, for example, was known for his mobility and his ability to spin out of danger. Randall Cunningham turned broken plays into highlight reel runs, using his legs to avoid punishment. But mobility wasn't a complete shield. Eventually, every quarterback had to stand tall in the pocket and take a hit. The hits themselves were far more punishing than what today's quarterbacks experience. Rules protecting the passer were minimal. A defender could drive his full weight into a quarterback, hit him high, hit him low, and land with crushing force, all without drawing a flag. Turf fields, common in that era, were unforgiving. A quarterback slammed into the ground might feel the aftereffects for weeks, especially if the surface was more like green-painted concrete than real grass. And yet, the role demanded resilience. Fans and teammates respected the quarterback who popped right back up after a massive blindside sack. It was a badge of honor, proof that he had the toughness to keep going no matter the beating. Injuries were often hidden or downplayed. Many quarterbacks played with cracked ribs, sprained shoulders, or bruised sternums, relying on painkillers just to make it through 4 quarters. The public saw the touchdowns, the glory, and the trophies. But those who played knew the truth. Quarterbacking was a job that tested not just skill, but the ability to endure sudden, violent impact without warning. Every time they stepped on the field, they were taking a calculated risk, one that could change their career with a single hit they never saw coming. The quarterback position in the earliest decades of professional football was not the glamorous, high-paying endorsement trick job we know today. In fact, it was one of the least desired spots on the field. The reason? Every single offensive snap, every play that began with the ball in the quarterback's hands was a potential disaster. There were no guarantees of protection, no rules shielding passers from bone-crushing hits, and no promise that the crowd would remember your brilliance if you succeeded. But if you failed, if your pass missed its mark or your team fell short in a critical moment, everyone knew exactly whose fault it was. That crushing reality was a burden that most men didn't want to carry. In the 1920s and 1930s, a quarterback wasn't the field general in the modern sense. He was often more of a traffic director, a player expected to hand the ball off, occasionally throw, and most importantly, take hits without complaint. Passing was rare and dangerous because the football itself was rounder and harder to grip, making precision difficult. A quarterback's completion percentage often hovered well below 40%, even for the very best in the league. Yet the expectations from coaches, teammates, and fans were towering. Be smart enough to read defenses, tough enough to withstand punishment, and steady enough to lead men older, bigger, and sometimes meaner than you. Imagine the pressure in that era. You're playing on a muddy field in November. The air sharp with cold, your hands stiff from the wind. Your leather helmet offers minimal protection. The defense knows exactly who you are and what you're about to do. There are no modern passing lanes, no rules to protect you from a late hit. If you drop back to pass, defenders will crash through the line with one goal hit you hard enough to make you think twice about trying again. Every throw is a gamble, and every incomplete pass chips away at the trust of your teammates and the patience of the fans. Quarterbacks in that time carried a unique kind of weight, both figurative and literal. Figuratively, they shouldered the blame for losses. Literally, they often absorbed the most punishing hits on the field. Offensive linemen were not yet the hulking specialists they are now. They were two-way players, smaller in stature, and not always able to hold off charging defenders. A quarterback had to be as tough as any lineman, as fast as any running back, and as aware as any coach. The position demanded more than physical skill, demanded leadership under fire. The mental toll was immense. Before every game, a quarterback would be handed the playbook, often just a thin stack of paper or even a few scribbled notes. It was up to him to know every detail, anticipate the defense's moves, and adjust plays on the fly without the benefit of radios in helmets or sideline tablets for instant replays. If a defense shifted unexpectedly, the quarterback had mere seconds to change the play, relying solely on instinct and a deep understanding of his teammates' strengths. That kind of mental agility was rare, and it separated the truly great quarterbacks from the merely good ones. Take, for example, Benny Friedman, one of the first passing stars of the NFL. Friedman's accuracy and vision revolutionized the position, but he was still a product of his time. He endured the same rough treatment as any other quarterback and often had to play through injuries that would sideline modern players for weeks. He understood the burden of being the man under center. Every fan in the stands and every player in the huddle expected him to be perfect, even in impossible situations. His legacy was built not just on his skill, but on his ability to bear the weight of those expectations. The stakes were not just personal, they were existential for teams. In an era when professional football was struggling to survive financially, a quarterback's performance could directly impact ticket sales. A thrilling win could boost attendance and bring in much-needed revenue. A string of losses could empty stadiums and push a franchise toward collapse. Quarterbacks, in many ways, were the public face of their teams long before television and mass media turned them into household names. A strong, confident quarterback could inspire a city. A shaky one could lead to the team folding entirely. The burden extended beyond game day. Quarterbacks often had to be community ambassadors, attending events, shaking hands with fans, and promoting the team in any way possible. They were expected to exude confidence and charisma, even if they were nursing injuries or dealing with personal struggles. That constant public visibility was another form of pressure that could weigh heavily on a player. And then there was the physical exhaustion. With smaller rosters, quarterbacks often played both offense and defense, meaning they were on the field for nearly the entire game. Imagine throwing a deep pass one play, then lining up at safety the next to stop a running back charging full speed. The stamina required was extraordinary, and the margin for error was razor thin. Fatigue made mistakes more likely, but excuses were not part of the job description. Even the locker room dynamics added weight to the role. A quarterback had to earn the respect of his teammates, many of whom came from hard, physical jobs in the offseason: coal miners, steel workers, factory laborers. These men respected toughness and resilience above all else. A quarterback who couldn't take a hit, who complained too much, or who folded under pressure would quickly lose the trust of his team. Leadership in that setting wasn't about giving rousing speeches. It was about proving, week after week, that you could take the punishment, get back up, and keep fighting. Despite the crushing weight of responsibility, there were those who embraced it. They saw the quarterback position not as a burden, but as a calling, a chance to guide their team through chaos, to make the crucial throw when it mattered most, to be the one who dared to take the risk. These were the players who defined the position for generations to come, laying the groundwork for the quarterbacks we see today. It's important to remember that the weight wasn't just about football. Many quarterbacks in that era were playing for more than just personal glory. They were representing their families, their towns, and in some cases, entire communities that saw them as symbols of hope and pride. For a young man from a small industrial town, making it as a quarterback in the NFL was just a personal achievement. It was a statement that someone from their background could rise to the top of one of the toughest sports in America. This combination of public expectation, physical danger, mental strain, and personal responsibility created a role unlike any other in sports at the time. The quarterback was both the most visible and the most vulnerable player on the field. Every decision, every throw, every mistake was magnified. And yet, for the few who could handle that weight, the rewards, while not always financial, were profound. They earned the respect of their peers, the admiration of fans, and a place in the history of a sport that was still fighting to establish itself in the American consciousness. The truth is, no one wanted to play quarterback in those early days, unless they were willing to carry all of that. It wasn't just about talent, it was about grit, resilience, and an unshakable belief in your ability to lead. The position demanded everything a man could give and then asked for more. And in that crucible, the legends of the game were forged. To understand just how dangerous the quarterback position once was, you have to picture what life was like in the pocket back in the earliest decades of football. Today, we think of the pocket as a relatively safe space, protected by massive linemen, guarded by rules that punish late hits or blows to the head. But in the 1920s, 1930s, and even well into the mid-20th century, the so-called pocket was less of a safe zone and more of a bull's eye painted on your back. Once you took the snap, you might have a heartbeat or two before chaos erupted all around you. The pocket in those days was essentially a shifting battlefield. Offensive lines were smaller, often lighter than the defensive linemen charging toward them. And because two-way play was the norm, linemen were already exhausted from playing defense on the previous series. They weren't specialized pass blockers like we have today. They were generalists, often learning their protection assignments from chalkboard diagrams before the game rather than intensive position-specific drills. The result? The quarterback rarely had more than 2 or 3 seconds to make a decision before being hit. And these weren't soft hits. The leather helmets of the time provided minimal cushioning, and the lack of face masks meant that collisions often involved bone on bone. Defensive players had free rein to grab, push, shove, and slam a quarterback into the dirt. Late hits were common, and there were no roughing the passer penalties to act as deterrents. Even if you released the ball, you were fair game. Some defenders prided themselves on making the quarterback pay for every pass attempt. A psychological tactic meant to make him hesitate next time. The toll on the body was brutal. Shoulder separations, cracked ribs, concussions. These injuries were not just possible, they were expected. A quarterback often played hurt, strapping on extra padding, taping joints, and hoping adrenaline would carry him through the game. There were no advanced medical evaluations or concussion protocols. If you could stand, you played. You couldn't, you risked losing your starting spot for good. In an era with small rosters and fewer safety nets, injuries were just another obstacle to overcome. The mental side of the job was equally punishing. A quarterback had to maintain clarity and composure, while being hunted by some of the most aggressive men on the field. He had to read defenses while hearing the roar of the crowd, feeling the crunch of cleats in the dirt, and anticipating the jolt of impact. There was no replay to review mistakes, no coach whispering in your helmet between plays. You learned, adapted, and reacted in real time, and if you made a poor decision, it was visible to everyone in the stadium. In this environment, trust between quarterback and offensive line was everything. Those linemen were not just blockers, they were the only barrier between the quarterback and an onslaught of pain. The best quarterbacks knew how to earn that trust, by standing tall in the pocket, taking hits without complaint, and showing they believed in their teammates' ability to protect them. In return, linemen would dig deep, pushing themselves to the limit to hold off defenders for just a fraction of a second longer. That fraction could mean the difference between a completed pass and a crushing sack. It's easy to see why some players avoided the quarterback role altogether. For many, the idea of standing still, waiting for a receiver to break free while knowing you were about to be blindsided, was simply too much to bear. Running backs could at least see their tacklers coming. Linemen could dish out as much punishment as they received. But quarterbacks, they were asked to make precision decisions while enduring a relentless physical assault, often without getting the glory that modern quarterbacks enjoy. The danger was amplified by the style of play. Passing was riskier because the ball was harder to throw accurately, and receivers faced their own brutal treatment downfield. Incomplete passes stopped the clock, giving defenses a breather and putting more pressure on the offense. A bad pass could easily swing momentum, and a turnover could cost your team the game. Every throw carried high stakes. Yet in the middle of all this, the position began to evolve. quarterbacks started to develop subtle ways of buying time-quick footwork, subtle pump fakes, deceptive handoffs. They learned to read defensive body language, predicting blitzes before the snap. These skills weren't taught in structured quarterback camps, they were learned the hard way. On the field, through trial and error. One of the earliest masters of this was Sid Luckman of the Chicago Bears in the late 1930s and 1940s, playing in the revolutionary T formation. Luckman showed how a quarterback could turn the chaos of the pocket into an opportunity. He embraced the danger, trusting his linemen and his quick release to neutralize the pass rush. His success proved that the position could be both strategic and thrilling, even under constant threat. Still, for every Sid Luckman, there were dozens of quarterbacks who struggled to survive more than a season or two in the spotlight. The physical punishment accumulated quickly, and with few financial rewards at the time, many players simply walked away. A quarterback in the 1930s might make only slightly more than a factory worker with no long-term security. If the risk outweighed the reward, the decision to leave was an easy one. Despite this, the men who stayed, who embraced the role, were building something bigger than themselves. They were redefining what it meant to be a quarterback, proving that leadership under fire was as much about resilience as it was about skill. They accepted that the pocket would never be truly safe, that the hits would keep coming, and that their every move would be scrutinized. And in accepting that, they elevated the position from an unwanted job to a badge of honor. The unseen battles in the pocket were not just physical, they were psychological. Quarterbacks had to conquer fear, doubt, and fatigue, while appearing unshakable to their teammates. They had to make split-second decisions that could alter the course of a game, all while knowing that one mistake could undo an afternoon's worth of hard work. It was a test of character as much as ability, and those who passed it became legends in their own right. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of grit, innovation, and sheer stubbornness from the men willing to stand in the crosshairs and take the hits. They showed that even in the most dangerous role on the field, greatness was possible. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for the modern quarterback, the leader, the playmaker, the icon. By the middle decades of professional football, the quarterback was no longer just a player who took the snap and delivered the ball. He had become the beating heart of the offense, the on-field general whose mind and decision-making determined the rhythm of every play. But with that evolution came an invisible weight, one that didn't show up on the stat sheet or in newspaper headlines. Leadership in the quarterback role wasn't a ceremonial honor. It was a daily, relentless responsibility that could grind down even the strongest personalities. In the early years, quarterbacks weren't protected by rules that shielded modern passers. They didn't have high-tech helmets, concussion protocols, or media teams polishing their image. What they had was a roster of teammates looking at them for direction, and a league full of defenses trying to knock them out of the game. A quarterback's leadership was tested in every huddle. It wasn't just about calling the right play. It was about reading the tension in a teammate's eyes after a turnover, rallying exhausted linemen on a cold, muddy field, and finding a way to inject belief into a team that might be trailing by 3 touchdowns. When a quarterback walked into the huddle, his tone of voice, body language, and level of composure dictated whether the offense moved forward with confidence or collapsed under pressure. This was leadership without microphones or post-game interviews. It was raw, in-the-moment trust building that had to happen in seconds. The challenge was magnified by the fact that quarterbacks often led men who were older, stronger, and in some cases, more experienced than they were. In the 1930s through the 1950s, many players were war veterans, steel mill workers, or farmhands who had endured hardships far beyond football. Gaining their respect required toughness, humility, and consistency. A young quarterback couldn't simply inherit leadership. He had to earn it on the field by standing in against a blitz, taking the hits without flinching, and delivering the ball even when the pocket collapsed around him. One bad decision could lose a game. One moment of hesitation could lose the huddle. The physical risks made this leadership role even more daunting. Every time a quarterback dropped back to pass, he exposed himself to hits that could leave him concussed, bruised, or worse. In the pre-face mask era, a poorly timed tackle could shatter a jaw or break a nose. Yet, the quarterback had to get up, dust himself off, and project confidence as if nothing had happened. His teammates were watching, and any sign of fear or self-preservation could ripple through the team's morale. That's why so many early quarterbacks had reputations for being stubbornly tough, because showing pain was never an option if you wanted to keep the trust of your offense. Then there was the mental toll. Quarterbacks in those decades had to memorize entire playbooks without the help of wristbands or communication devices. There were no coaches speaking into their helmets. The quarterback had to remember down and distance, anticipate defensive adjustments, and call audibles on the fly based on what he saw at the line of scrimmage. This was mental chess played in real time, often in front of roaring crowds and under miserable weather conditions. If the rain turned the ball into a slippery bar of soap, or the wind turned passes into wobbly projectiles, the quarterback still had to adapt and make plays. Perhaps the hardest part of quarterback leadership was the isolation it created. While other players could joke on the sidelines or vent their frustrations without much consequence, the quarterback lived under a constant microscope. Every decision was judged, every mistake magnified. If the team lost, fingers pointed at the man under center. And in those earlier decades, there were no multi-million-dollar contracts or endorsement deals to soften the blow, only the pride of knowing you had done your job as best you could, even if the scoreboard said otherwise. Many of these quarterbacks carried the weight of leadership long after the final whistle. The pressure to perform, the physical pain, and the mental strain didn't switch off in the locker room. Some wrestled with self-doubt in private, wondering if they had made the right calls or missed opportunities that could have changed the game. Others replayed hits in their minds, feeling the lingering effects in aching joints and recurring headaches. Yet for all the challenges, the role of quarterback remained a calling for a certain kind of player, person who could blend physical courage, mental sharpness, and emotional resilience into a single presence on the field. This invisible burden also forged legends. Leaders like Sammy Baugh, Otto Graham, and Sid Luckman didn't just excel. Because of their arm strength, they inspired teams with their steadiness under pressure. They faced defensive linemen eager to drive them into the turf and still delivered pinpoint passes. They absorbed the boos of hostile crowds and still rallied their offenses in the fourth quarter. And in doing so, they defined a standard for leadership that modern quarterbacks still strive to meet. To understand why quarterback was once considered the most dangerous position, not just physically, but psychologically, you have to see it through the eyes of those early leaders. They weren't only fighting the opposing defense, they were battling fatigue, injury, doubt, and the unspoken expectation that they had to be perfect. And somehow, despite the hits, the scrutiny, and the constant risk of failure, they kept leading. Because in football, leadership isn't just a role at S, a responsibility you can hand off when things get tough. In the early decades of professional football, playing quarterback was an invitation to punishment. Protective equipment was primitive. The rules heavily favored defenses, and medical care lagged far behind modern standards. This meant that when a quarterback got hurt, the injury often wasn't just a setback, could be a career-ender or a life-altering blow. The reality was simple. Stepping under center meant accepting that you might not finish the game, the season, or even the career you had worked your whole life to achieve. Helmets were little more than hardened leather caps, offering minimal protection from the crushing impact of a defensive lineman, forearm, or the helmet-to-head collision of a blitzing linebacker. Padding was thin and poorly fitted, leaving ribs, shoulders, and knees vulnerable. In the 1930s and 1940s, broken noses, missing teeth, and concussions were almost a badge of honor. A quarterback's face after a game could tell the story without a single highlight reel swollen lips. blackened eyes, and a glaze of exhaustion from playing through hits that would send most people to a hospital. The most common injuries for quarterbacks were concussions, cracked ribs, separated shoulders, and knee damage. The problem was, in those days, there was no real return-to-play protocol. If you could walk, you could play. Coaches expected their quarterbacks to tape up, grit their teeth, and get back in the game. It wasn't uncommon for a player to get knocked out cold, be revived on the sideline, and then return to take the next snap. The long-term consequences, chronic headaches, memory loss, depression, weren't understood. Or worse, were ignored in the name of toughness. One of the most dangerous scenarios was the blindside hit. Without modern offensive line protections or specialized blocking schemes, quarterbacks were often left exposed to defenders coming full speed from their non-throwing side. The impact wasn't just about the hit, it was the whiplash effect. The body being twisted violently as the quarterback was slammed into the hard, unforgiving ground. Many players walked away from football with permanent neck stiffness, back problems, or shoulders that would never fully heal. Finger and hand injuries were another occupational hazard. In an era when quarterbacks often played both ways, sometimes lining up in the secondary on defense, hands were constantly at risk. Gripping the ball after jamming a finger on a defender's helmet or breaking a knuckle during a fumble scramble was part of the job. There were no custom-molded gloves or high-tech splints. Quarterbacks often had to improvise, wrapping their hands with whatever tape or cloth was available and hoping it would hold together for the next series. Lower body injuries could be even more devastating. A twisted ankle might seem minor, but in a league where fields were often little more than uneven patches of dirt and grass, that instability could lead to repeated sprains or ligament tears. Knee injuries, particularly torn cartilage, were essentially career-threatening before the advent of arthroscopic surgery. Players who suffered them often hobbled for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact of these injuries was just as real as the physical pain. Every quarterback knew that one wrong step or one mistimed throw could leave him open to a hit that might end his season. The mental toughness required to stand in the pocket, knowing a defender was coming full speed, was enormous. This is why quarterbacks who could consistently make accurate throws under pressure were so revered by teammates, because they were risking their bodies on every play. Medical treatment was rudimentary. Trainers often carried smelling salts, liniment, and rolls of tape, and that was the extent of sideline care. There were no Mr. Is to diagnose ligament tears, no concussion baseline tests to determine brain trauma. Injuries were assessed by sight and touch, and decisions about whether to return to play were made in minutes, often with the player's competitive instinct overriding common sense. Some quarterbacks became legends, not just for their stats, but for their ability to play through unimaginable pain. Stories of players leading fourth-quarter drives with broken ribs or throwing touchdown passes with dislocated fingers became part of football folklore. This toughness was celebrated by fans and coaches, but it also set a dangerous precedent that real quarterbacks never came out of the game. The cumulative toll of these injuries was devastating. Many retired quarterbacks in the mid-20th century walked with limps, had limited mobility in their arms, or lived with chronic pain. Yet when asked, many would say they'd do it all over again because the pride of playing the most important position in football outweighed the cost. It wasn't that they didn't understand the risk, it was that the risk was the job. Understanding this brutal reality adds another layer to why quarterback was once the most dangerous position in the NFL. It wasn't just about the hits during the game, it was about the lasting damage that followed them into the rest of their lives. And still, every Sunday, they lined up, took the snap, and faced the storm again. The NFL we know today has evolved into a league with advanced safety rules, highly specialized equipment, and an entire network of medical professionals ready to respond within seconds. But for the quarterbacks of earlier eras, these luxuries didn't exist. Playing quarterback without modern protection was like stepping into a bare-knuckle boxing match. You knew you'd get hit. You just didn't know how bad it would be that day. Helmets were the first and most obvious difference. Before polycarbonate shells and face masks became standard, quarterbacks wore leather caps that provided little more than cosmetic coverage. These helmets offered no meaningful shock absorption, and a direct blow could leave a player dizzy, disoriented, or unconscious, even after hardshell helmets came into play in the 1940s. The earliest versions had single or double-bar face masks that barely covered the mouth and nose. Defensive players often used their hands, arms, and even forearms as weapons, smacking quarterbacks across the head or under the chin without fear of a penalty. Shoulder pads of the time were thin, rigid, and restrictive. Instead of dispersing the energy of a hit, they simply transferred the force to another part of the body. When a defensive tackle drove a quarterback into the turf, those pads didn't soften the blow, they simply prevented bones from breaking on the first impact. Bruises, muscle strains, and nerve damage in the shoulders and collarbone region were common, and quarterbacks had to adapt their throwing motion to work around these injuries. Uniforms themselves provided almost no protection. Today's quarterbacks benefit from compression gear that supports muscles, gloves with improved grip, and turf shoes designed for stability. Decades ago, a uniform was essentially a wool or cotton jersey and pants with a thin pad sewn in at the hips and thighs. The fabric absorbed water on rainy days, making it heavy and uncomfortable, and the lack of mobility meant quarterbacks were slower and easier to hit. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of playing without modern protection was the absence of effective rules to shield quarterbacks from dangerous contact. Today, a low-hit, helmet-to-helmet collision or late shove on a quarterback often results in a flag and penalty yards. Back then, such plays were celebrated as signs of defensive dominance. Quarterbacks could be body-slammed well after throwing the ball, grabbed by the face mask, or even tackled by the headband. The officials rarely intervened. Even the playing surfaces contributed to the danger. Natural grass fields were often poorly maintained, with uneven patches that increased the likelihood of ankle and knee injuries. In colder climates, frozen turf could feel as hard as concrete, amplifying the impact of every sack. Artificial turf, when it was introduced in the late 1960s, brought its own problems, namely turf burns, joint stress, and a higher rate of non-contact knee injuries. Communication technology or the lack of it also made quarterbacks more vulnerable. Without helmet radios, quarterbacks had to run to the sideline to get the next play, which increased fatigue and made them more susceptible to mistakes. Mistakes, in turn, often led to sacks or turnovers, putting the quarterback in harm's way even more frequently. What's remarkable is how quarterbacks adjusted to these dangers. They learned to throw quicker, to move within the pocket with subtle footwork, and to anticipate where the hit was coming from. They developed an almost sixth sense for defensive pressure because there was no protective bubble around them. Quarterbacks like Sammy Baugh, Otto Graham, and Johnny Unitas became legends not only for their skill, but for their ability to survive in such a brutal environment. Despite the dangers, the position carried a sense of pride. To line up as quarterback in those days meant you accepted the reality that your body was the first and last line of defense against injury. There was no relying on padded shells, reinforced helmets, or favorable rules. You were on your own, protected only by your awareness, quick decision-making, and the grit to take a hit and get back up. In many ways, this era shaped the identity of the quarterback position. It forged leaders who were as tough physically as they were mentally, and it created a legacy that modern quarterbacks still feel today. Every protective rule, every piece of advanced equipment, Kelta, and every medical precaution in the current game exists because generations of players endured without them. Playing quarterback without modern protection was not just a test of skill, it was a test of survival. And those who passed that test earned not only their place in history, but also the respect of every player who came after. In today's NFL, playing quarterback is a dream job, lucrative contracts, endorsement deals, and the spotlight that comes with being the face of a franchise. But in the early days of the league, the quarterback position was often the last role anyone wanted. It wasn't because players didn't respect the position. It was because they understood the risks, the hardships, and the complete lack of reward compared to the danger. First, there was the pay war, rather, the lack of it. NFL salaries in the early and mid-20th century were modest at best. And unlike now, the quarterback was not necessarily the highest paid player. Sometimes, linemen or running backs commanded just as much money, if not more, depending on their reputation and local popularity. A quarterback could take more hits than anyone else on the field and still end the season with a paycheck that barely covered living expenses. Then there was the physical punishment. In an era before the league put protective rules in place, quarterbacks were targeted relentlessly. Defensive players didn't just want to stop a pass. They wanted to remove the quarterback from the game entirely. Without the benefit of today's roughing the passer penalties, late hits were fair game. If you stood in the pocket to throw, you did so knowing that a 250-pound defender might spear you in the ribs long after the ball was gone. Another reason for the reluctance was the offensive philosophy of the time. Passing wasn't as central to the game as it is today. Many teams relied heavily on the running game, which meant the quarterback often acted as a glorified handoff machine. This left little opportunity for the glamour or highlight plays that modern quarterbacks enjoy. When passes were called, they were frequently long, low-percentage throws that carried a high risk of interception, further adding to the pressure and scrutiny of the position. The offensive line also wasn't as specialized or technically skilled as it is now. Protection schemes were rudimentary, and blocking assignments often left gaps that blitzing defenders could easily exploit. Quarterbacks had less time to make decisions and less confidence that their line could shield them from the inevitable rush. If a quarterback held the ball too long, he paid for it sometimes with cracked ribs, separated shoulders, or worse. The mental toll was another major factor. Quarterbacks were expected to be team leaders, calling plays in the huddle and reading defenses without the benefit of modern coaching tools or sideline communication. Every mistake was theirs to own, and in an era when substitutions were limited, they often stayed on the field even when injured. Playing through pain wasn't a choice. It was a necessity if you wanted to keep your spot. Public perception also contributed to the hesitancy. In some football circles, the quarterback was not seen as the warrior figure he is today, but rather as the guy who needed to be protected. In a culture that prized toughness above all, some players preferred positions where they could deliver hits rather than take them. The quarterback role, with its high visibility and high risk, wasn't for everyone, and many athletes consciously avoided it. There's also the simple fact that quarterbacks in that era didn't have the long-term career stability that comes with the position today. One bad season, one serious injury, or even one rough game could see a quarterback replaced without hesitation. The job security was non-existent, and with so many capable players eager for a spot on the roster, there was always someone ready to step in. Despite all this, some players embraced the challenge. They saw quarterbacking as a test of courage, intelligence, and resilience. These were the men who helped shape the position into what it would later become. But the reality remained. For every player who wanted the ball in his hands and the responsibility on his shoulders, there were many more who quietly hoped the coach would look elsewhere when choosing a signal caller. The reluctance to play quarterback in the early NFL wasn't rooted in fear, it was rooted in practicality. If you wanted a longer career, fewer injuries, and less blame when things went wrong, there were safer and more rewarding positions to choose from. And yet, those who did step into the role knew they were joining a select group willing to take the hits, make the throws, and carry the weight of a team's success or failure. That willingness, rare then and rare now, was what made them unforgettable. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, football was evolving, and so too was the quarterback position, though not overnight and certainly not without resistance. This was still an era when most players, coaches, And fans saw the quarterback less as a glamorous field general and more as a willing target for chaos. The bruises, the unrelenting hits, and the weight of responsibility hadn't lessened. But somewhere between the grit of old-school football and the growing spectacle of the professional game, cracks began to form in the wall of reluctance. Slowly, the quarterback position was starting to reveal another side, one that hinted at leadership, respect, and even the faint promise of stardom. It wasn't a sudden revolution. The transition was gradual, driven not by one man, but by a handful of quarterbacks who didn't just survive the position, they thrived in it. These pioneers stepped into the role at a time when the rules still gave defenses the upper hand, when blockers couldn't use their hands to fend off defenders, and when a quarterback could be thrown to the ground well after releasing the ball without drawing a penalty. Playing quarterback still meant risking physical punishment that could derail a season or even a career. But now, there was the faint possibility that a player who mastered the role might elevate his team in ways no other position could. Take Otto Graham, for example, leading the Cleveland Browns in the 1940s and 50s. Graham was a model of consistency, winning championships in both the All-America Football Conference and the NFL. He was no stranger to the physical toll. His nose was broken, ribs cracked and body battered across his career, but his ability to read defenses, deliver precise throws under pressure, and manage the game's tempo began to shape a new narrative. He wasn't just a tough competitor. He was proof that a quarterback could be the difference between winning and losing at the highest level. Graham's success planted a seed in the minds of young players and coaches. Maybe the quarterback wasn't simply a position you were stuck with when no one else wanted it. Maybe it could be the role you chased because it gave you control over the game's outcome. This was a quiet but important turning point. Coaches started scouting players with better passing mechanics, quicker decision-making, and the mental toughness to handle hostile defenses. Still, the risk was immense. Even the quarterbacks who shined were far from untouchable. Sammy Baugh, the Washington legend known as Slinging Sammy, had transformed passing from a desperation move into a viable offensive weapon. Yet he played much of his career with the same leather helmet and minimal padding as the players in the 1920s. He took brutal hits, was expected to play defense in some seasons, and punted for his team as well. The quarterback position was expanding in responsibility, but the level of protection was barely improving. What made this bridge era so fascinating was its dual identity. On one hand, quarterbacks were still symbols of vulnerability targets who had to endure the brutality of the game. On the other, they were slowly becoming the faces of their franchises. Television was just beginning to bring football into American homes, and when fans saw the quarterback under center, calling plays and orchestrating drives, it was hard not to recognize that here was the team's nerve center. The growing visibility of the quarterback role also changed its appeal. For decades, players had been drawn to positions where they could dominate physically linemen, running backs, linebackers. But with each broadcast, the quarterback's voice in the huddle, his presence in the pocket, and his game-winning throws began to take on a certain allure. It was no longer just about avoiding punishment. It was about seizing the opportunity to lead. However, let's be clear, this wasn't yet the era of the modern passing game. Defenses still dictated much of what happened. Passing plays were riskier than running the ball, and many coaches leaned heavily on ground-and-pound offenses. Quarterbacks were still judged as much by their toughness as by their throwing arm. In fact, in some locker rooms, you weren't considered a real quarterback unless you could take a hit from a 240-pound defensive tackle, pop back up, and call the next play without flinching. What began to tip the balance was the recognition that quarterbacks who could both withstand the physical abuse and elevate their team's offense were worth their weight in gold. Sid Luckman of the Chicago Bears had already proven in the 1940s that innovative passing attacks could dominate. But it was the consistency of players like Graham Baugh and Norm Van Brocklin that convinced coaches to invest more in developing passing skills. Van Broecklyn, nicknamed the Dutchman, was known for his cannon-like arm and ability to exploit defenses deep downfield. And he helped usher in a new appreciation for quarterbacks who could win games with their mind as much as their body. This was also the era when offensive lines began to adapt, slowly but surely, to the unique needs of their quarterbacks. Though far from the protective walls we see today, blocking schemes became more deliberate. Running backs were tasked with staying in to pass protect on certain downs. A small but significant acknowledgement that keeping the quarterback upright might just be the best path to victory. For young athletes coming up in the high school and college ranks, the quarterback role was no longer automatically dismissed as a punishment. Yes, it still required absorbing some of the hardest hits in football, but it also came with the thrill of orchestrating game-winning drives, the satisfaction of outsmarting a defense, and the possibility still distant but growing of being remembered as more than just a tough survivor. Fans, too, were beginning to shift their perception. Instead of just admiring the bone-crunching collisions, they started to appreciate the chess match unfolding on the field. Quarterbacks were seen making audibles at the line of scrimmage, threading passes through tight coverage and pulling off comebacks in the final minutes. In this slow evolution, the quarterback's brain was becoming as celebrated as his brawn. Still, it would take another decade before rule changes and offensive philosophies fully embraced the quarterback as the centerpiece of the sport. For now, in the 1950s, the position was straddling to worlds the rough-and-tumble past where survival was the primary objective, and the dawning future where the quarterback's mind, arm, and leadership would define the game. This bridge generation of quarterbacks deserves credit not just for their skills, but for their willingness to take on a role that was still dangerous, still unforgiving, yet increasingly influential. They were the transitional figures who endured the brutality, but also laid the foundation for what the position could become. Without their resilience and vision, the quarterback might never have evolved into the sport's most coveted role. As the decade closed, the seeds they planted were ready to grow. The NFL was entering a new era, one where the passing game would take center stage. Television audiences would expand, and quarterbacks would begin to emerge not just as leaders of their teams, but as cultural icons. The transformation was far from complete, but the direction was clear. The quarterback's journey from unwanted to unrivaled was underway, and the game would never look back. The 1980s were a turning point for the quarterback position in the NFL, not only in style of play, but in how the league, the fans, and the players themselves viewed the role. This was the decade where television exposure exploded, where Monday Night Football became a cultural event, and where the quarterback began to emerge not just as a game manager, but as a brand. And yet, beneath the surface of this growing spotlight, the job still carried immense risk, little protection, and an unforgiving standard of performance. By the early 1980s, quarterbacks were still being hit hard, and rules protecting passers were minimal compared to today. Defensive linemen were bigger, faster, and stronger than ever, and coaches were drawing up exotic blitz packages to exploit weaknesses. Quarterbacks didn't have the quick-release passing games that dominate today. SNFL many were still expected to hold the ball, wait for deep routes to develop, and throw under immense pressure. One bad read or one mistimed step could lead to a crushing sack that left the QB slow to get up, shaking off the effects and trying to line up for the next play. This era also marked the rise of some legendary names: Joe Montana, John Elway, Don Marino, and others who redefined how the position could be played. Montana brought precision and calmness under pressure, leading the 49ers to 4 Super Bowl wins. Marino's quick release and laser arm rewrote the passing record books. Elway's arm strength and ability to make plays on the run gave Denver fans hope, even in improbable situations. These players didn't just play the game, they made people believe in the quarterback as the heartbeat of a franchise. For every Montana or Marino, there were other QBs who were chewed up by the unforgiving demands of the position and quickly replaced. It's important to remember that in the 1980s, teams were still heavily dependent on their run games. A quarterback's role often centered around managing the offense, avoiding mistakes, and converting key third downs. If the team had a great defense and a strong running back, the quarterback's job was easier, but when those pieces weren't there, the QB bore the brunt of the blame for any losses. Fans and media often criticized quarterbacks harshly, sometimes ignoring the fact that they had been sacked 6 or 7 times in a game or pressured on almost every dropback. Another key change in this period was the evolution of offensive strategy. The West Coast offense, pioneered by Bill Walsh, began to spread across the league. It relied on short, precise passes to control the game and wear down defenses. This system helped reduce the number of big hits on quarterbacks as they could get the ball out quicker. However, it also demanded near-perfect timing and decision-making, leaving little margin for error. Quarterbacks running this system had to be as mentally sharp as they were physically tough. Off the field, the quarterback's image started to become part of the league's marketing. They were the faces on posters, the stars of commercials, and the subjects of intense media attention. This visibility brought endorsement deals and fame, but it also meant that their mistakes were amplified. A bad game on Sunday could lead to a week of criticism on talk shows and in newspapers. The mental toughness required to handle this scrutiny was enormous, and not every talented passer could manage it. Injuries were still a constant threat, and medical technology wasn't what it is today. A separated shoulder, a torn ligament, or even a severe concussion could derail a season or end a career. Protective equipment was improving, but not fast enough to keep up with the growing size and speed of defenders. Quarterbacks played through pain more often than not, sometimes risking long-term health for the sake of keeping their team competitive. The idea of playing hurt was considered a badge of honor, and many QBs who did so earned the respect of their teammates, but at a significant personal cost. This decade also saw some of the most memorable comebacks and clutch performances in NFL history. Montana's legendary Super Bowl drive against the Bengals. Elway's the drive against the Browns in the AFC Championship game. And Moreno's miracle finishes cemented the image of the quarterback as the ultimate leader under pressure. These moments inspired a generation of kids to dream of playing the position. But they also hid the grind, pain, and risk that came with it. Meanwhile, quarterbacks who didn't meet the standard weather because of injuries, poor team support, or inconsistency often disappeared from the league quickly. The NFL was becoming more competitive, and franchises had less patience for developing a QB who didn't immediately produce results. The constant churn at the position meant that for every superstar, there were multiple forgotten names who had brief and brutal experiences trying to survive behind shaky offensive lines. The 1980s, in many ways, set the stage for the quarterback's transformation into the modern NFL superstar. The seeds of the rules that would later protect QBs were planted here, as the league began to realize the value of keeping its most marketable players healthy. The passing game's expansion and offensive innovation began to give quarterbacks more control over the game. And while the risks remained high, the potential rewards, both in terms of winning and personal legacies, started to grow. For quarterbacks in this era, success wasn't just about arm strength or athleticism. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the ability to perform when the entire stadium and millions of viewers expected you to deliver. The role was still unprotected in many ways, still unrewarded if you weren't winning, and still unglorified for those grinding away on losing teams. But for those who could master it, the 1980s offered a chance to build a lasting legacy that would be remembered long after the final whistle. And as the decade closed, the position stood at the brink of yet another evolution. The quarterbacks who survived the 1980s both. The legends and the journeymen had set the standard for toughness and leadership, paving the way for a new era that would redefine the balance between risk and reward. The next chapter in the quarterback's story would see the NFL taking its first serious steps toward protecting its most valuable asset. By the early 1970s, the quarterback position had undergone yet another evolution. The NFL was no longer just about brute force and running between the tackles. The forward pass, once considered risky and even gimmicky, was becoming a central weapon in offensive playbooks. This shift created both opportunity and danger for quarterbacks. On one hand, their value in deciding the outcome of games increased dramatically. On the other, their exposure to defensive punishment multiplied. Quarterbacks were now required to hold on to the ball longer, scan the field for open receivers, and deliver accurate throws while towering defensive linemen closed in at full speed. The league was also experiencing a defensive renaissance. Teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, Steel Curtain, and the Minnesota Vikings, Purple People Eaters, built reputations on punishing hits and relentless pressure. In this environment, quarterbacks were not just expected to be tacticians, they had to be warriors. The lack of modern protective equipment made the situation even more dangerous. Helmets had improved since the leather cap days, but they were still far from today's safety standards. Face masks were minimal, padding was thinner, and rib protectors were often optional. Every dropback carried the risk of a fractured rib, a separated shoulder, or worse. This era saw the emergence of quarterbacks like Terry Bradshaw, Fran Tarkenton, and Roger Staubach, players who brought different styles to the position but shared one trait: toughness. Bradshaw could launch the ball deep downfield, Tarkenton could scramble and improvise, and Staubach combined leadership with clutch playmaking. But all of them took hits that would likely draw penalties in today's game. Their resilience was celebrated, but the physical toll was enormous. Staubach, for example, suffered multiple concussions injuries that were often downplayed or outright ignored at the time. Players were routinely told to shake it off and get back in the huddle, even when dazed or disoriented. Part of the quarterback's challenge in this era was the changing complexity of defenses. Coordinators began disguising coverages, mixing blitz packages, and rotating defensive backs to confuse the passer. Quarterbacks had to read and react in real time, often with less than 3 seconds before being hit. Those who couldn't adapt found themselves benched or out of the league. It was a survival-love-fittest environment, and only the most mentally sharp and physically durable could endure. The quarterback's public image also began to shift. Television broadcasts brought the game into millions of homes, making quarterbacks the most visible faces of their teams. They became celebrities, but the glamour was misleading. The highlight reels showed the touchdown passes, but not the bruises, sprains, and cracked bones sustained along the way. Off the field, these men lived in a strange contradiction, admired for their heroics, but treated as replaceable if their performance dipped. The 1970s also marked the beginning of more vocal conversations about player safety, although it would be decades before significant changes were implemented. A few rule adjustments attempted to protect quarterbacks, such as stricter penalties for late hits, but enforcement was inconsistent. The prevailing culture still rewarded toughness over caution. Coaches expected their quarterbacks to stand in the pocket until the very last second, knowing that this often meant taking a bone-jarring hit. Some quarterbacks of this era adapted by becoming quicker decision-makers. Tarkenton's scrambling was as much about survival as it was about creating plays. Others, like Bradshaw, relied on their offensive lines to buy enough time for deep throws. But regardless of style, all shared the same reality. They were targets. Defensive players openly admitted to trying to knock the quarterback out of the game, knowing it could tilt the outcome in their team's favor. It was not considered unsportsmanlike. It was simply part of football's brutal code. Financially, the quarterback position was still not as disproportionately rewarded as it is today. While top quarterbacks earned decent salaries compared to the average player, they weren't making generational wealth. Many still worked off-season jobs to supplement their income. This imbalance between risk and reward was a major reason why, despite the position's growing prestige, some athletes hesitated to pursue it seriously. The glory came at a steep price, and there was no guarantee of long-term security. In the locker room, respect for quarterbacks was earned, not given. Teammates judged them not just on arm strength or accuracy, but on their willingness to take hits and keep playing. Stories circulated of quarterbacks playing through broken fingers, torn ligaments, and deep lacerations. In some cases, they would be given painkillers or injections to get through games practices that masked symptoms but risked further injury. The long-term consequences were rarely discussed. Yet, despite all this, the quarterback's role as a leader became more cemented in the 1970s. They were the ones who had to inspire belief in the huddle, command respect in the locker room, and face the media after both victories and crushing defeats. Fans and analysts began to frame football narratives around quarterback rivalries, setting the stage for the era of superstar passers in the 1980s. As the decade came to a close, it was clear that the quarterback position had never been more influential, more dangerous. The league's passing game had evolved, the spotlight had intensified, and the hits had grown harder. The quarterbacks who survived did so through a blend of intelligence, adaptability, and sheer grit. But the warning signs were already there. The physical and mental toll of the job was unsustainable without greater protections. The next era would bring changes. But in the 1970s, being an NFL quarterback meant living on the knife's edge between heroism and catastrophe. By the mid-1990s, the quarterback position was no longer the lightly regarded, often overlooked role it had been in the sport's early decades. It was becoming the centerpiece of modern football. But with this evolution came a new type of pressure. No longer was the quarterback just a man under center calling plays. He was now the face of a franchise, the standard-bearer of a city's hopes, and the focal point of the media's relentless attention. For those who thrived under that kind of spotlight, the rewards could be extraordinary. For those who struggled, the position could quickly become a crucible, exposing every flaw, magnifying every mistake, and, in some cases, ending careers far sooner than anyone imagined. One of the defining features of the 1990s quarterback experience was the way the game's offensive philosophies began to shift. Coaches were embracing more complex passing concepts, using spread formations, shotgun snaps, and quick-release throws to exploit defenses that were built to stop the run. On paper, this should have made life easier for quarterbacks fewer. Bodies around the line of scrimmage meant cleaner passing lanes and more opportunities to connect with receivers in space. But in reality, this strategic revolution put more on the quarterback's shoulders than ever before. Instead of simply managing a game and leaning on a strong rushing attack, the quarterback was now expected to dissect defenses in real time, anticipate blitz packages, and deliver the ball with pinpoint accuracy, all while defensive coordinators were inventing new ways to generate pressure. This was the era when legends like Brett Favre, Steve Young, and Troy Aikman were redefining what it meant to play the position. Favreau's Ironman streak and fearless gunslinger mentality inspired fans, but it also came at a cost. He absorbed hits that would leave most players sidelined. Young, one of the most athletic quarterbacks of his generation, thrived in San Francisco's West Coast offense. But his mobility often put him in the crosshairs of pursuing linebackers, leading to a series of concussions that eventually forced his retirement. Aikman, the leader of the Cowboys dynasty, was known for his toughness. Yet he too battled concussion issues and other injuries, all while carrying the weight of keeping a championship roster competitive year after year. For quarterbacks who weren't future Hall of Famers, the stakes were just as high, sometimes higher. A single bad season could mean the end of a starting job, and with rookie contracts becoming more valuable to salary cap-conscious teams. Veteran quarterbacks without elite resumes often found themselves replaced by younger, cheaper players. It wasn't just about skill anymore. It was about economics, marketability, and the long-term vision of a franchise. A quarterback who didn't fit the plan could find himself on the trading block or released before he even had a chance to hit his stride. The 1990s also brought new challenges in the form of defensive innovations. Zone blitzes became a staple of NFL playbooks, allowing defenses to disguise their intentions and confuse quarterbacks at the snap. Pass rushers were becoming faster and more versatile, capable of dropping into coverage one play and exploding into the backfield the next. Quarterbacks had to read these shifting looks in a matter of seconds, all while keeping their eyes downfield and avoiding catastrophic mistakes. One wrong read could lead to a turnover, and in an era when games were often decided by just a few plays, that kind of error could be the difference between a playoff berth and an early offseason. Then there was the mental side of the job. Quarterbacks in the 1990s were under an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Thanks in large part to the explosion of sports talk radio, highlight shows, and eventually the early days of the internet. Every decision, every throw, every interception was dissected by analysts and debated endlessly by fans. The pressure to perform wasn't just about winning games, it was about meeting the expectations of millions of people who felt entitled to critique your every move. The mental toll of that kind of exposure could be just as damaging as any physical injury. Yet, amid all of this, the quarterback position remained alluring. The chance to lead a team, to control the pace and flow of a game, to be the player who touched the ball on every offensive snap, that was a challenge worth embracing. The great quarterbacks of the 1990s didn't just survive the era's pressures, they thrived in them. They developed unshakable confidence, cultivated trust with their teammates, and learned to block out the noise of critics and doubters. In many ways, this decade set the stage for the quarterback-dominated NFL we see today. The offensive strategies that emerged in the 1990s laid the groundwork for the pass-heavy game that would explode in the 2000s. Quarterbacks became not just players, but brands' marketable stars whose influence extended far beyond the field. And yet, even as the position's prestige grew, its dangers remained. The hits were still brutal. The responsibilities were still immense. The margin for error was still razor-thin. It's in this crucible of the 1990s that the quarterback's dual identity, as both a glamorous superstar and a target under constant attack, was fully realized. Every snap was a test. Every throw was a gamble. Every victory was hard-earned. For the men who played the position during this era, the lessons learned were as enduring as the scars they carried. The quarterback was no longer an afterthought in the grand scheme of football strategy. He was the engine, the heartbeat, the irreplaceable leader. And the price of being that central to the game was higher than ever before. The quarterbacks who rose to prominence in this period didn't just help their teams win games, they changed the trajectory of the sport itself. They showed what was possible when skill, courage, and preparation met opportunity. And as the decade closed, the NFL stood on the cusp of a new millennium, ready to embrace even bigger offensive explosions and more prominent quarterback play. But the question remained, could the men under center withstand the growing demands of the most important and most dangerous position in sports? By the early 2000s, the quarterback position was standing on the edge of a revolution, one that had been building for decades, but was about to accelerate like never before. The NFL, after years of incremental changes, was finally beginning to embrace a vision of the game, where quarterbacks were not just field generals, but protected assets given every chance to succeed and placed at the very heart of the league's appeal. And yet, the transformation was not just about rules, it was about mindset. It was about investment. It was about a league deciding once and for all that the quarterback was no longer the most dangerous position to play, at least in the physical sense, but still the most challenging, prestigious, and defining role in all of sports. This was not an overnight shift. It was the culmination of years of conversations between coaches, owners, players, and even the league's broadcast partners. Television ratings data made one fact very clear. When quarterbacks played well, fans tuned in. Star power mattered. A game featuring Peyton Manning against Tom Brady was not just a football game. It was a cultural event. And so, the NFL began to double down on its investment in the position, changing rules to protect quarterbacks from hits to the head, implementing stricter enforcement of roughing the passer penalties, and prioritizing offensive freedom so passing attacks could thrive. But this new era also brought an entirely different kind of challenge for quarterbacks. Yes, they were taking fewer brutal hits than their predecessors in the 1970s and 1980s, but the mental strain of the position had never been higher. Defensive coordinators were adapting to the league's offensive explosion, designing exotic blitz packages and disguising coverage schemes that required split-second diagnosis. Quarterbacks now had to master the game from the neck up at a level unmatched in football history. This was the era of the film room quarterback, a new archetype that combined physical talent with obsessive preparation. Legends like Drew Brees, who famously studied hours upon hours of tape, were setting the standard. Peyton Manning, with his encyclopedic recall of defensive tendencies, was practically an on-field coach. Even quarterbacks known for their athleticism, like Donovan McNabb and Steve McNair, had to expand their mental playbooks to keep pace with the rapidly evolving game. And while rules were making it safer to play the position physically, the stakes for performance were higher than ever. A bad season could cost a quarterback his starting job. A string of poor performances in primetime games could damage a career. The quarterback was now the face of the franchise, the player most likely to be featured on commercials, billboards, and video game covers. But that visibility came with relentless scrutiny from fans, media, and ownership. Quarterbacks in this era also had to deal with the expanding influence of social media. A single mistake on the field could be clipped, replayed, and mocked online within seconds. This was a new kind of pressure, one that earlier generations never had to experience. The mental toughness required to tune out the noise became just as critical as the ability to throw a perfect deep ball or convert a crucial third down. The 2000s also saw the rise of quarterback-specific coaching at a level never seen before. Private quarterback trainers became a growing industry, working with both NFL players and young prospects in the offseason. Mechanics were fine-tuned, footwork drilled relentlessly, and throwing motions analyzed frame by frame. The science of playing quarterback was evolving, and those willing to adapt had a clear advantage. But as much as the game was changing in terms of protection and preparation, it was also shifting in style. Offensive coordinators began to blend elements of the college game into the NFL, incorporating shotgun formations, spread concepts, and more quick-release passing. This allowed quarterbacks to get the ball out faster, reducing the number of hits they took, while keeping defenses on their heels. For many, it was a welcome adjustment, a way to extend careers and maximize efficiency. Yet, even with all these improvements, the position remained as mentally taxing and emotionally demanding as ever. The margin for error was razor thin. One bad throw in a playoff game could define a quarterback's legacy. One poorly read blitz could swing a season. And so, the quarterback of the 2000s had to be not just a skilled passer, but a leader, a tactician, a motivator, and a symbol of resilience. The success stories of this period, Manning, Brady, Brees, Rodgers, all share one common trait: relentless work ethic. They set the tone for their franchises, elevating not just their own play, but the performance of everyone around them. This was the new reality of the quarterback role. It wasn't enough to survive physically. You had to dominate mentally and inspire consistently. And for every quarterback who rose to the challenge, there were others who struggled under the weight of expectations. The spotlight was brighter than ever, and not everyone could handle it. This was still the NFL, still the most competitive football league in the world. And while the quarterback position was no longer defined by constant physical punishment, it was now defined by its unforgiving mental grind. In a way, this was the final evolution in the journey from unprotected, unrewarded, unglorified, to protected, valued, and glorified, but still demanding. The quarterback's body might have been safer, but their mind was now the battlefield. The greatest of this era embraced that reality, using every resource available to perfect their craft. And in doing so, they not only redefined the position, they cemented its status as the most important role in all of professional sports. The next chapter in this story would bring even more change. A new generation of quarterbacks, unlike any the league had seen before. Athletic, adaptable, fearless, and versatile. They would take the foundations laid by the legends of the 2000s and push the entirely new frontier. By the time we arrive at the modern game, the quarterback position has undergone a remarkable transformation. From the bruised and battered field generals of the 1930s to the commanding, celebrated athletes of today, the role has shifted in ways that earlier players could never have imagined. But what makes the quarterback position truly fascinating is not just the evolution of its strategy and protection, but the journey of how it went from being the NFL's most avoided job to becoming the sport's most coveted role. In the earliest days, quarterbacks were little more than traffic directors in leather helmets, handing the ball off to running backs who were considered the stars of the offense. Passing was rare, risky, and often met with skepticism. Protection schemes were minimal, so quarterbacks frequently absorbed bone-crushing hits without the benefit of modern padding or rules to protect them. In those days, a quarterback's life expectancy on the field was short, and the idea of a franchise QB was not even part of the football vocabulary. Fast forward several decades, and the landscape began to shift. The rule changes of the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly those designed to protect quarterbacks from late hits and head contact, dramatically changed the way offenses operated. Passing became more viable, and offensive playbooks expanded. Suddenly, quarterbacks were no longer just game managers, they were decision makers, field commanders, and the focal point of offensive design. The shift brought with it a new era of opportunity, but also a new layer of pressure. What's easy to overlook is that this transition didn't happen overnight. The journey from unglorified, unrewarded, and unprotected to celebrated centerpiece took decades of incremental change. This was fueled by a combination of evolving coaching philosophies, player skill sets, and the growing entertainment value of the forward pass. Fans began to crave the excitement of deep throws, precision timing routes, and last-minute comebacks. And who was at the center of all that? The quarterback. With that came unprecedented responsibility. Modern quarterbacks are expected to master enormous playbooks, read defenses in milliseconds, and make perfect decisions under the relentless glare of national television. In a single game, they can face hundreds of split-second choices that will determine the outcome not just of the game itself, but potentially the trajectory of their careers. And while protections have improved, the physical toll remains steep. Defensive linemen today are bigger, faster, and stronger than ever before. Even with roughing the passer penalties in place, one misstep in the pocket can result in a hit that lingers for weeks. Financially, the quarterback role has exploded into one of the most lucrative in all of sports. The top players command contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, far surpassing what any other position can earn. But with those massive paychecks comes enormous public scrutiny. Every interception, every missed throw, every playoff loss becomes part of a player's legacy, debated endlessly by analysts and fans. For all its glory, the job remains mentally taxing in ways most spectators will never fully appreciate. The modern quarterback also lives under the microscope of media and social media. In the past, criticism was confined to sports columns and post-game talk shows. Today, quarterbacks face 24/7 feedback loops, tweets, memes, highlight reels, and endless hot takes dissecting every decision. It's not just about playing well anymore. It's about projecting the image of leadership, resilience, and charisma, both on and off the field. Another underappreciated aspect is the quarterback's role as the face of the franchise. In many cases, they are the first voice the public hears after a win or a loss. They must navigate press conferences with grace, represent their team in community events, and often serve as the tie between the fans and the organization. It's a balancing act of maintaining authenticity while also understanding the power and consequences of every word spoken. Even with all these challenges, the position now attracts the most competitive athletes in the sport. Kids grow up idolizing quarterbacks, wearing their jerseys, and practicing their signature throwing motions in backyards. College programs design offenses to showcase quarterback talent, preparing players for the NFL spotlight before they even step onto a professional field. The pipeline from youth leagues to the pros is filled with aspiring signal callers, all dreaming of hoisting the Lombardi Trophy as confetti falls around them. And yet, with all its glamour, the quarterback position still carries echoes of its dangerous past. Careers can still end abruptly with a single injury. Pressure can still overwhelm even the most talented players. And the margin for error remains razor thin. One bad season can mean losing a starting job. One poor playoff performance can overshadow years of excellence. It's a role where success is celebrated, but failure is magnified tenfold. What makes the quarterback story so compelling is this duality. It is both the most desired and the most demanding job in football. To succeed, a quarterback must combine physical talent, mental acuity, leadership skills, and emotional toughness in a way that no other position requires. That's why, even after decades of evolution, the position continues to captivate fans and analysts alike. Today's quarterbacks stand on the shoulders of the pioneers who played through broken noses, muddy fields, and bare-bones protection schemes. They benefit from advanced training, nutrition, analytics, and technology that their predecessors could only dream about. Yet the core challenge remains the same. Take the snap, make the read, deliver the ball, and lead your team to victory again and again, under the brightest lights and the heaviest expectations. As we look at the quarterback's place in the modern NFL, it's clear that the position's journey mirrors the evolution of the sport itself. From survival to stardom, from anonymity to icon status, it has been a transformation unlike any other in professional athletics. But the story is far from over. The demands will keep rising, the competition will keep intensifying, and the spotlight will only grow hotter. And that's the beauty of it. Every generation will produce quarterbacks who redefine what's possible, players who combine skill, intelligence, and heart in a way that inspires millions. The future of the position promises to be just as fascinating as its past, and the next great quarterback is already out there, waiting for the moment when preparation meets opportunity. By the late 1980s, the quarterback position had undergone a transformation that would have been unimaginable just a few decades earlier. No longer simply a figure who handed off the ball and occasionally threw a pass. The quarterback had become the centerpiece of every offense, the most visible player on the field, and often the highest-paid athlete in the game. Yet, beneath the glamour and endorsements, there remained a hidden truth. The danger, the responsibility, and the relentless mental strain were still there, just dressed in a more polished package. This era was defined by the rise of pure passers. Quarterbacks whose arms became weapons capable of dismantling defenses in seconds. The West Coast offense, made famous by Bill Walsh and Joe Montana, emphasized quick, precise throws that neutralized the pass rush. It made quarterback play more cerebral, requiring lightning-fast reads and accuracy under pressure. On paper, it seemed to make life easier for quarterbacks, but in reality, it placed even greater demands on their mental processing and preparation. The margin for error shrank, and mistakes were magnified in ways that could cost games and careers. By the early 1990s, the NFL had begun to subtly adjust its rules to encourage passing and protect quarterbacks. Hits to the head were penalized more frequently. Late hits drew flags. But these protections, while important, did not erase the inherent risks. A quarterback still had to stand in against a blitzing linebacker, still had to take a hit from a defensive end who outweighed him by 70 pounds, and still had to maintain his composure while the pocket collapsed around him. And unlike most players, quarterbacks didn't get to rotate out. They played every offensive snap unless they were injured or benched. The media's fascination with quarterbacks also reached a fever pitch during this period. Players like Troy Aikman, Dan Marino, John Elway, and Steve Young became household names, each bringing a distinct style to the game. Aikman was the leader of a dynasty, Marino a record-breaking passer, Elway the comeback king, and Young the dual threat who could beat you with his arm or legs. But with fame came pressure. Every throw was analyzed, every decision scrutinized, and every failure amplified. The quarterback was not just an athlete. He was a brand, a spokesperson, and the face of the franchise. Behind the scenes, many of these quarterbacks were quietly enduring injuries that would have sidelined players in less demanding positions. Concussions were still poorly understood and often downplayed. Shoulder and elbow injuries were masked with painkillers. Broken ribs were wrapped, and players were told to tough it out. The image of the quarterback as a protected, untouchable star was only partly true, and in many ways, dangerously misleading. The playbook for a quarterback in this era became a mental marathon. Complex defensive schemes meant that quarterbacks had to spend hours in film study, memorizing tendencies, learning to disguise plays, and anticipating adjustments. They became part coach, part analyst, and part performer. On Sundays, they had to execute with precision in front of millions, knowing that one mistake could undo an entire week's preparation. There was also a new kind of physical demand emerging. Mobile quarterbacks, while celebrated for their ability to escape pressure and extend plays, often paid a heavy price for that creativity. Randall Cunningham, for example, dazzled fans with his agility and improvisation, but his style exposed him to more hits. In many ways, mobility was both a gift and a gamble. It could win games, but it could also shorten careers. And still, the quarterback position retained its paradox. It was the most coveted and feared role in football. For every young player dreaming of leading a team to a Super Bowl, there was the knowledge, sometimes unspoken, sometimes shouted, that the role came with enormous personal sacrifice. You had to accept the weight of the franchise on your shoulders, the expectation to perform under impossible circumstances, and the knowledge that the physical and mental toll could follow you long after you left the field. What set this era apart, however, was the resilience of those who played the position. They embraced the changes, adapted to the evolving game, and in doing so, set the stage for the modern quarterback. The passing numbers exploded, television ratings soared, and the quarterback became synonymous with the NFL itself. The league marketed its stars relentlessly, building storylines around them and making them the focal point of rivalries and playoff runs. But even as the quarterback rose to a new level of prominence, the unspoken reality remained. This was still football, and football was still violent. All the rule changes, all the protections, all the schematics, none of it could fully shield a quarterback from the fundamental truth that one play, one hit, one moment could change everything. That knowledge lingered in every huddle, in every snap, and in every long walk back to the sideline after a crushing sack. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, the league stood on the edge of another transformation. Quarterbacks were about to step into an era where technology, analytics, and even stricter safety measures would further reshape the game. But no matter how much the role evolved, the essence of the position, the leadership, the responsibility, the courage under fire would remain unchanged. The next generation would inherit not only the glory, but also the burdens. And the story of the quarterback as the NFL's most dangerous position would continue to be written, one snap at a time. The crowd inside the stadium could feel the energy long before the opening kickoff. There was something different in the air that day. The quarterback stepping onto the field wasn't just playing for stats, a contract, or even the championship. He was playing for a legacy his own, and the legacy of those who came before him. Every yard, every throw, and every snap had the weight of decades of history pressing down on his shoulders. You could see it in the way he carried himself, calm, collected, and focused, yet with an intensity that said he knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about winning the game, was about proving that the quarterback position was no longer the forgotten, unprotected, and unrewarded job it had once been. As the first quarter began, the defense came at him hard, testing his pocket presence. Blitz after blitz, the kind of rushes that, in the old days, would have ended careers. But here he was, sidestepping, reading the field, and firing laser passes with pinpoint accuracy. The offensive line, bigger and more skilled than the ones from decades earlier, held the wall for him, giving just enough time to make magic happen. Every successful play was a tribute to how far the position had come. Years of rule changes, training advancements, and evolving playbooks had transformed what was once considered a dangerous gamble into a role that could dictate the entire flow of the game. The second quarter showcased not just his skill, but his adaptability. Defensive coordinators were throwing exotic coverages at him, trying to confuse and rattle him. In the 1970s or 80s, this might have been enough to force mistakes. Back then, quarterbacks were expected to stand tall, take the hits, and somehow keep going, even without the protections modern rules provide. Now, with a deeper understanding of defenses, film study tools, and quarterback coaches dedicated solely to the craft, he was reading coverages faster than the defense could disguise them. What used to be chaos was now a chessboard, and he was thinking 3 moves ahead. By halftime, the scoreboard reflected a tight battle. The quarterback jogged into the tunnel with the same composure he had at the start. But in the locker room, you could sense the leadership qualities that separated great quarterbacks from good ones. He wasn't just reviewing plays, he was rallying the offense, talking to receivers about route adjustments, encouraging linemen to trust their technique, and reminding the running backs of the balance they needed to keep the defense honest. It was the intangible presence that couldn't be measured in statistics, the same quality that old-school quarterbacks like Bart Starr or Roger Staubach carried with them. The respect of the room was his, not because of his title, but because of his actions. The third quarter began with a drive that will be remembered by every fan who witnessed it. Backed up on their own 10-yard line, the offense needed to march down the field against one of the toughest defenses in the league. The quarterback executed a perfect mix of short passes, quick handoffs, and well-timed deep shots. The pocket collapsed more than once, but his ability to escape danger while keeping his eyes downfield turned potential sacks into big gains. This was the evolution of quarterback play, combining the grit of the old era with the speed, agility, and precision of the modern game. Each completion was met with roars from the crowd, not just because of the yards gained, but because they were watching the position's full transformation in real time. By the start of the fourth quarter, the game was on the line. Down by 4 points, the offense had one final shot at a game-winning drive. This was the moment every quarterback dreams about. Every rep in practice, every film session, every off-season workout, all comes down to drives like this. The huddle was quiet as he called the first play, but his voice was steady. The team believed. The first snap went to a quick out to the sideline, moving the chains. The second play, a perfectly timed seam route, picked up 20 yards. The defense was scrambling now, trying to adjust. With less than a minute left, the ball sat just outside the red zone. The tension in the stadium was thick enough to feel in your chest. And then it happened, the play that would be replayed for years. The defense sent an all-out blitz, desperate to end the drive. In the old days, this would have been a blindside hit with no flag, and the quarterback might not have gotten up. But today, a split-second release under pressure sent the ball spiraling perfectly into the hands of his receiver, who crossed the goal line untouched. The crowd erupted, the sideline exploded, and in that moment, could see the culmination of decades of change in the sport. The quarterback was no longer a sitting duck in the pocket, but the centerpiece of the offense, protected, respected, and celebrated. As the clock hit 0, confetti began to fall. He wasn't just a player who had led his team to victory. He was a living example of what the quarterback position had become: a fusion of mental mastery, physical talent, and strategic brilliance. Looking around at his teammates, coaches, and the cheering fans, he knew he was standing on the shoulders of those who had endured the harder years. Those who took the hits, who sacrificed their bodies, and who fought for recognition long before the position became glamorous. This wind was theirs too. Walking off the field, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the stadium lights. The roar of the crowd still echoed in his ears. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not just for the victory, but for the journey the quarterback role had taken over the decades. It was once the most dangerous job in football, and now, because of the resilience of the players and the evolution of the game, it had become one of the most celebrated. The transformation was complete, but the respect for its history would never fade. The story of the NFL's most dangerous position is not merely a tale of physical peril. It is a story of transformation, courage, resilience, and remarkable achievement. From its humble and harrowing beginnings as an unprotected, unrewarded, and unglorified role to the celebrated, highly specialized, and iconic position that quarterbacks hold today. The journey reflects both the evolution of the sport itself and the enduring spirit of those who dared to take the snap and lead their teams on the gridiron. In the early decades of professional football, quarterbacks faced challenges that went far beyond the plays called in the huddle. They were often working grueling day jobs: coal miners, steel workers, or military veterans, balancing exhausting labor with the physical and mental demands of football. The equipment was rudimentary, the protection minimal, and the risks of injury ever present. Yet, despite these obstacles, these early pioneers laid the groundwork for what would become the most revered position in American sports. Their grit and perseverance earned respect not just from their teammates, but from an entire nation discovering a new passion for football. As the NFL grew, so did the importance and visibility of the quarterback. Rule changes designed to protect passers allowed them to stand taller in the pocket and lead more complex offenses. The role shifted from a game manager to the central figure on offense, responsible not only for executing plays, but for inspiring teammates, outsmarting defenses, and performing under immense pressure. The quarterback became the ultimate embodiment of leadership both on and off the field. This leadership extended beyond the game. Quarterbacks became role models, community leaders, and sometimes cultural icons. Their influence transcended sports, touching lives through charity, activism, and public engagement. This evolution enriched the NFL's legacy, connecting players to fans in deeply meaningful ways. The quarterback was no longer just a player. He was a symbol of hope, perseverance, and excellence. The physical demands of the position remained formidable. Modern quarterbacks face defenders faster, stronger, and more athletic than ever before. Despite advances in protective gear and rules to safeguard them, every snap carries the risk of injury. The sport's increasing speed and intensity mean that quarterbacks must combine agility, toughness, and quick decision-making in a way few other athletes do. They are expected to absorb hits, evade pressure, and maintain focus while scanning the field for opportunities, all while under the spotlight of millions of fans and cameras. Mental toughness is perhaps the greatest challenge. Quarterbacks shoulder the expectations of entire franchises, with success or failure often resting on their shoulders. Each game can be a test of composure, resilience, and poise. The pressure is relentless, magnified by media scrutiny and the passionate voices of fans. Yet the best quarterbacks thrive in this environment, using the challenge as fuel to elevate their performance. What makes this story truly inspiring is the unwavering passion that drives every player who takes on the quarterback role. From the backyard, dreamers tossing footballs on Saturday afternoons, to the professionals commanding packed stadiums on Sundays, the desire to lead, to excel, and to make history is universal. The position demands not only physical skill, but a mindset of relentless improvement, courage in the face of adversity, and a heart dedicated to the team. Technology and analytics have transformed how quarterbacks prepare and perform. The introduction of sophisticated video analysis, virtual reality training, and data-driven play calling has pushed the position into new realms of strategic mastery. Quarterbacks study opponents' tendencies in unprecedented detail, refine their mechanics with biomechanical precision, and collaborate with coaches to optimize every aspect of their game. This melding of science and sport has elevated the quarterback's role from mere athlete to elite tactician. The quarterbacks of today stand on the shoulders of giants, legends who blazed trails despite harsher conditions and less recognition. Their stories are woven into the fabric of the NFL, reminding us that greatness is built through sacrifice, perseverance, and a steadfast commitment to excellence. Icons like Johnny Unitas, Joe Montana, and Peyton Manning redefined the position, blending athletic prowess with leadership that inspired teams and captivated fans worldwide. Moreover, the quarterback position has become a beacon for innovation and diversity within the sport. The rise of dual-threat quarterbacks who combine passing skills with running ability has added new excitement and complexity to the game. Players like Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson have shattered traditional molds, showing that adaptability and athleticism can redefine what it means to be a successful quarterback. This evolution continues to inspire young athletes from all backgrounds to dream big and break barriers. The role also highlights the importance of teamwork and trust. A quarterback's success depends not only on individual talent, but on seamless collaboration with coaches, offensive linemen, receivers, and running backs. The chemistry built through hours of practice, film study, and mutual respect is essential. This shared commitment to a common goal is a powerful reminder that even the most celebrated position in football thrives only through unity and cooperation. Off the field, many quarterbacks leverage their platforms to impact communities positively. They engage in charitable work, promote youth sports programs, and advocate for causes that extend well beyond the game. Their leadership serves as a model not just for aspiring athletes, but for anyone striving to make a difference. The quarterback position, therefore, represents not only excellence in sport, but the broader potential to inspire and uplift. Looking ahead, the future of the quarterback position is bright and full of promise. As training methods continue to advance, as protective measures evolve, and as strategic innovations unfold, quarterbacks will continue to push the boundaries of what is possible. The game will grow faster and more dynamic, and the role will adapt accordingly, always at the heart of football's thrilling drama. Yet amid all this change, one thing remains constant. The quarterback is the embodiment of courage and leadership. The position demands an extraordinary combination of skill, intellect, and emotional strength. It requires a willingness to embrace risk, to persevere through setbacks, and to inspire those around you to be their best. For NFL fans worldwide, the quarterback is the ultimate symbol of the sport's excitement and spirit. The narrative of the NFL's most dangerous position is ultimately one of victory, not only on the scoreboard, but in the hearts and minds of those who play and watch the game. It is a story of overcoming adversity, embracing evolution, and celebrating the human spirit's resilience. Every quarterback who has stepped onto the field contributes to this rich legacy, each snap a chapter in an ongoing saga of greatness. Thank you for joining this comprehensive journey into the heart of the quarterback position. We hope this exploration has deepened your appreciation for the players who lead their teams with unmatched dedication and passion. Their stories remind us all why football is more than a game, is a testament to perseverance, leadership, and the pursuit of excellence. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth NFL stories that celebrate the incredible athletes and history of this beloved sport. Comment below your favorite quarterback moment or player. We read every comment and look forward to hearing your stories and insights. The quarterback position stands as a shining example of how sport can inspire, challenge, and unite. Its journey from danger to glory is a powerful reminder that with resilience, courage, and dedication, greatness is always within reach. The journey of the NFL quarterback is one that inspires awe and admiration. From a position once deemed the most dangerous, unprotected, and unappreciated role on the field, the quarterback has risen to become the very symbol of leadership, courage, and excellence in American football. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was forged through decades of evolution, sacrifice, innovation, and an unwavering spirit that defines the very heart of the game. At its core, the quarterback position is about more than just physical ability. It is the ultimate test of mental fortitude, quick thinking, and the power to inspire a team. The quarterback is a leader who carries the weight of the entire offense and often the hopes of an entire fan base. Every snap, every throw, and every decision has the potential to change the course of a game and, by extension, history itself. This enormous responsibility is accepted willingly by those who step into the role, demonstrating a passion and dedication that resonates far beyond the gridiron. The unglorified dangers that quarterbacks faced in the early years, when helmets were leather and protections were nearly non-existent, laid the foundation for the modern game. Their toughness, resilience, and perseverance set a standard of bravery that continues to inspire players today. Their stories remind us that greatness is born from challenge, and that the most demanding roles often lead to the most profound triumphs. With time, the NFL adapted. Rule changes were introduced to protect the quarterback, emphasizing player safety while still maintaining the integrity and excitement of the game. Offensive strategies evolved, training became more sophisticated, and technology revolutionized preparation and analysis. The quarterback's role expanded to include not just execution, but also strategic leadership, reading defenses with an almost unparalleled football IQ. In today's game, quarterbacks are celebrated as icons both on and off the field. They are the faces of franchises, role models in their communities, and ambassadors of the sport worldwide. Their influence reaches beyond football, touching culture, charity, and inspiring the next generation of athletes. This evolution from unprotected workhorse to celebrated superstar is a testament to their enduring impact and the growth of the NFL as a whole. The modern quarterback faces tremendous pressure, but also unprecedented support. Coaches, analysts, and teammates work tirelessly to optimize every aspect of their performance: sports science, nutrition, and cutting-edge training. Techniques ensure that quarterbacks can compete at the highest level while minimizing risk. This comprehensive approach underscores the respect and value placed on the position, reflecting how far the NFL has come in honoring those who lead the game. Yet, amid all the advancements, the essence of the position remains unchanged. The quarterback must still embody leadership, resilience, and courage. They must rise to every challenge, inspire those around them, and embrace the mental and physical demands with unwavering dedication. The core qualities that define the earliest quarterbacks still shine through today, connecting past and present in a powerful legacy. For fans, the quarterback is often the heart of the team, the player who embodies hope and the possibility of victory. Watching a quarterback command the field with precision, poise, and passion brings a unique joy and excitement to the game. It is a role that captures the imagination and stirs emotions. Reminding us why football is more than just a sport. It is a shared experience that unites communities and generations. As we reflect on the journey of the NFL's most dangerous position, we also look forward with anticipation. The future holds incredible promise, with young quarterbacks emerging who combine skill, intelligence, and athleticism in ways never seen before. Innovations in training, strategy, and safety will continue to elevate the position, creating new heroes and new stories that captivate fans around the world. This ongoing evolution is a celebration of the human spirit, the drive to improve, to overcome obstacles, and to achieve greatness. It reminds us that every player who takes the field, especially those who embrace the challenge of quarterbacking, contributes to something much bigger than themselves. They carry forward a tradition of excellence and leadership that defines the NFL. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of the quarterback's role as the NFL's most dangerous position. We hope this journey has deepened your appreciation for the incredible athletes who shape the game and the inspiring legacy they uphold. Their stories are a powerful reminder that through resilience, dedication, and passion, greatness is always within reach. If this video resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more insightful NFL content. Share your favorite quarterback moments or thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from fellow fans and celebrating the game together. The quarterback position is not just a role on the field, it is a testament to the power of leadership, courage, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. It stands as a shining example of what makes football the thrilling, inspiring sport we all cherish. Here's to the quarterbacks past, present, and future, the true workhorses of the game who continue to redefine what it means to be great.